The crackling static of the radio hissed into the empty void, Kael's voice breaking through like a whisper against the silence. Day 147. No signs of life. His words hung heavy in the air, swallowed by the vast expanse of ash and ruin. The wasteland stretched endlessly, a graveyard of metal and bone under a sky choked with perpetual gray. His boots crunched against the cracked earth, each step a reminder of the solitude he carried like a second skin. Then it came a deafening roar that split the horizon. The ground beneath him trembled violently, sending a cascade of debris tumbling from the skeletal remains of a nearby tower. Kael spun around, his heart pounding as his gaze locked onto the source. A brilliant crimson flare streaking through the ash-laden clouds, its light cutting through the gloom like a beacon. His breath hitched. Flares meant life or worse danger. The radio sputtered again, this time with a faint, distorted signal. "This is Sector 7. "Anyone respond?" The voice was faint, desperate, and gone as quickly as it came. Kael clenched the radio tighter, his mind racing. Sector 7. It couldn't be. That place was a myth, a ghost story survivors whispered about in the dark, but the flare was real, and if there was even a chance. He slung his pack over his shoulder, his grip tightening on the rusted blade at his side. The wasteland had taught him one thing above all else: hope was a dangerous thing. But sometimes it was the only thing left. The flare's light dimmed as it descended, vanishing beyond the jagged ruins to the east. Kael's eyes narrowed. Whatever lay out there, he had to find it. The wasteland didn't give second chances. The wind carried the faint scent of smoke, sharp and acrid, as Kael began his march toward the unknown. The flare had marked the beginning of something, whether salvation or ruin, he couldn't yet tell. But the wasteland had a way of pulling you in, one step at a time, until there was no turning back. And Kael, he was already in too deep. Kael moved cautiously through the jagged terrain, his boots crunching against the cracked earth. The flare's light had faded, leaving only a faint trail of smoke curling into the ash-laden sky. His instinct screamed at him to stay alert. This was no ordinary signal. The wastelands were a treacherous place, and every flicker of hope could just as easily be a trap. But something about the urgency of that flare compelled him forward. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was in real danger. As he crested a small ridge, the source of the flare came into view, a crumpled escape pod, its metal hull scorched and twisted from a violent descent. Smoke billowed from its ruptured seams, and the faint hum of failing systems echoed in the eerie silence. Kael's hand instinctively went to the blaster at his side, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. Nothing, just the pod half buried in the dirt and the faint outline of a figure slumped against its side. He approached slowly, every step deliberate, his senses on high alert. The figure was a woman, her armor battered and scorched, her face streaked with soot and blood. She was barely conscious, her breath shallow and ragged. As Kael knelt beside her, her eyes fluttered open, wide with panic. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The Scavengers," the words hit Kael like a punch to the gut. Scavengers, the word alone was enough to send a chill down his spine. They were the worst kind of predators in the wastelands, ruthless, relentless, and utterly without mercy. If they were on their way, there was no time to waste. The woman's eyes rolled back and she slumped unconscious against the pod. Kael's mind raced. He couldn't leave her here, that much was clear. But taking her with him would slow him down, and the Scavengers were undoubtedly closing in. He glanced around, weighing his options. The pod was a lost cause, its systems fried beyond repair. There were no supplies here, no weapons, nothing to give him an edge, just a dying woman and the promise of imminent danger. The decision came in an instant. He couldn't abandon her. Whatever the cost, he'd find a way to keep them both alive. Kael slung her over his shoulder, gritting his teeth against the added weight. She was lighter than he expected, her armor doing little to mask the frailty beneath. He adjusted his grip, his eyes darting to the horizon. The scavengers could emerge from any direction, and he needed to be ready. As he moved, his mind churned with questions. Who was she? Where had she come from? And why were the scavengers after her? There was no time to dwell on it now. Survival was the only priority. Kael's boots pounded against the cracked earth as he pushed forward, his muscles burning with the effort. Every second counted, and the weight of the woman on his shoulders was a constant reminder of the stakes. The wasteland stretched out before him, a barren expanse of rock and ruin. Somewhere out there, the scavengers were closing in, their hunger for destruction unrelenting. Kael tightened his grip on the woman and pressed on, his resolve hardening with every step. He didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain: they wouldn't go down without a fight. Kael tightened his grip on Lyra's arm, his boots crunching against the cracked asphalt as he pulled her toward the entrance of the hidden bunker. The air was thick with the stench of rust and decay, and the dim light from his flickering lantern cast long shadows across the crumbling walls. He had found the bunker years ago during one of his scavenging runs, a relic from the old world, buried deep beneath the wasteland. It was one of the few places left where he could disappear, where the scavengers wouldn't think to look. Lyra stumbled beside him, still groggy from the blow that had knocked her unconscious. Her breathing was shallow, her face pale under the grime and blood. Kael didn't know who she was or why she had been out here alone, but he wasn't about to leave her to die. Not yet, anyway. The bunker door creaked open with a groan, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. Kael half-carried, half-dragged Lyra down the steps, his muscles straining under her weight. The air grew colder the deeper they went, and the faint hum of old machinery echoed through the corridors. He laid her down on a makeshift cot in the corner of the main chamber, his eyes scanning her for signs of injury. She was bruised and battered, but nothing seemed broken. He rummaged through his pack, pulling out a canteen and a strip of cloth. He dabbed the cloth with water and pressed it to her forehead, watching as her eyelids fluttered. It didn't take long for her to stir. Her eyes snapped open, darting around the room in confusion before locking onto Kael. For a moment, she looked terrified, her body tensing as though ready to bolt. But then recognition flickered in her gaze, and she relaxed slightly, though her wariness remained. "Where am I?" she croaked, her voice hoarse but sharp. "Safe," Kael replied curtly, stepping back to give her space. "For now, you're lucky I found you when I did. The scavengers don't leave survivors." Lyra sat up slowly, wincing as she moved. She glanced around the room, taking in the makeshift shelves lined with salvaged supplies and the faint glow of the emergency lights. "This place, it's old world tech," she murmured, more to herself than to Kael. Her fingers brushed against the edge of the cot, tracing the faded logo of a long-forgotten corporation. "You've been living here when I need to," Kael said, his tone guarded. He crossed his arms, studying her with narrowed eyes. "Now it's your turn. Who are you, and what were you doing out there?" Lyra hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. She seemed to weigh her options, deciding how much to reveal. Finally, she looked up, her expression resolute. "My name is Lyra Voss. I'm a scientist from the Arcturus colony, one of the last surviving orbital stations. I was sent here to retrieve something, a vital energy core buried in the wastelands. It's the key to keeping Arcturus operational. Without it, the colony will fail." "Millions will die," Kael's brow furrowed. He had heard whispers of the orbital colonies, floating remnants of humanity's golden age, but he'd never met anyone who claimed to be from one. "If you're from space, why come down here? The wastelands are a death sentence." "We didn't have a choice," Lyra said, her voice tinged with frustration. The core was lost during the collapse. It was supposed to be recovered decades ago, but the mission failed. Now we're running out of time. My team and I were sent to finish what they started. But her voice faltered and she looked away, her jaw tightening. We were ambushed. The Scavengers knew we were coming. They wiped out my team. I barely escaped. Kael's eyes narrowed. The Scavengers were brutal, but they weren't known for their strategic prowess. If they had anticipated Lyra's team, someone must have tipped them off. You think they were waiting for you? I know they were, Lyra said bitterly. Someone betrayed us. I don't know who, but they knew exactly where and when we'd land. They stripped us of our gear, killed my team, and left me for dead. If you hadn't found me, she trailed off, her hands clenching into fists. Kael leaned against the wall, his mind racing. If what Lyra said was true, the energy core she was after could change everything. It could mean power, stability, maybe even a way to rebuild, but it also meant danger. The Scavengers wouldn't stop until they had it, or until Lyra was dead. And if they were willing to betray an orbital colony, they had resources far beyond what Kael had ever seen. This core, he said slowly. Where is it? Lyra looked at him, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. Why do you care? Kael shrugged, his expression unreadable. Let's just say I've got a vested interest in not letting the Scavengers get their hands on it. If it's as important as you say, it's worth finding. But if we're going after it, you're going to have to trust me. And I need to know everything, no secrets. For a long moment, Lyra said nothing. Then, finally, she nodded. Fine, but if we're doing this, we do it my way. The core is buried deep in the ruins of an old research facility. It's heavily guarded, not just by Scavengers, but by automated defenses left over from the collapse. Getting to it won't be easy. Kael smirked, a spark of determination lighting his eyes. Easy's overrated. Let's just hope you're as good at surviving as you are at science. Lyra leaned forward, her voice steady but urgent as she laid out the stakes. The energy core, it's more than just a piece of old tech. It's the key to restoring power to the colony. If we can get it, we could give humanity a fighting chance to survive out here. Her words hung in the air, heavy with possibility, but Kael's expression remained unmoved. He crossed his arms, his jaw tightening as he shook his head. Nothing's worth dying for out here, he muttered, his tone bitter and final. The room fell silent, the weight of his skepticism pressing against Lyra's determination. She knew Kael wasn't one to take risks lightly. Not after everything they'd lost, not after the wasteland had hardened him. But she also knew there was more to this mission than just survival. I get it, she said softly, her voice cutting through the tension. You've seen too much, lost too much, but this isn't just about us. It's about everyone who's left. The colony, the families trying to rebuild, they need this, we need this. Kael's eyes flicked to hers, a flicker of something unreadable passing through them. He looked away, his gaze settling on the cracked floor beneath his boots. Even if it's true, he said, his voice low, you're talking about a suicide mission. The wasteland doesn't forgive mistakes, Lyra. You know that. She nodded, her resolve unwavering. I do, but there's something else you need to know. She paused, choosing her words carefully. The core's location, it's near your old home, the place where you grew up. For a moment, Kael didn't move. His expression shifted, the hardness in his eyes giving way to something softer, something almost fragile. The valley, he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Lyra confirmed, her tone gentle but firm. The same valley. If we can make it there, we might not just find the core, we might find answers about what happened. About why we're still here. Kael exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair as he processed her words. The valley, his childhood home, was a place he hadn't dared to think about in years. It was a memory buried under layers of dust and regret, a place where the world had once felt whole, and now Lyra was telling him it might hold the key to humanity's survival. He looked at her, his skepticism still present but tempered by something else, a glimmer of hope, faint but undeniable. "You're sure about this?" he asked, his voice quieter now, less guarded. Lyra nodded. "As sure as I can be. The coordinates match, and the intel we've pieced together points to the valley. It's not just a chance to save the colony, Kael. It's a chance to reclaim something we thought was lost forever." For the first time in what felt like years, Kael allowed himself to imagine it. The valley as it once was, the green fields and clear streams, the place where he'd learned to survive long before the world fell apart. It was a dangerous thought, one that stirred emotions he'd worked hard to bury. But it was also a reminder of what they were fighting for, not just survival, but a future worth living in. He took a deep breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly as he met Lyra's gaze. "All right," he said, his voice firmer now. "We'll do it, but if this goes south, I'm blaming you." A small smile tugged at the corners of Lyra's lips. "Fair enough," she replied, "but if it works, you'll owe me." Kael shook his head, a faint smirk breaking through his usual stoicism. "Don't push your luck," he said, but the tension in the room had eased, replaced by a shared sense of purpose. The mission ahead was dangerous, and the odds were stacked against them. But for the first time in a long time, Kael felt something he'd almost forgotten: hope. And that, he realized, might just be worth fighting for. Kael tightened the straps of his pack, his eyes scanning the horizon as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the cracked earth. Lyra stood a few paces ahead, her silhouette sharp against the fading light. She turned to him, her voice firm but edged with urgency. "We don't have time for caution," she said, gesturing toward a faint path that snaked into the distance. "If we go around, we'll lose days. The Scavengers are already too close. This is our only chance." Kael hesitated, his instinct screaming at him to avoid the radioactive zone she was pointing to. He'd heard the stories, entire patrols vanishing without a trace, the air itself turning toxic, the ground littered with the remnants of those who dared to cross. But Lyra's logic was hard to ignore. Every hour they spent skirting the danger was another hour the Scavengers could close in. Still, the thought of stepping into that cursed place made his skin crawl. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low. "That place, it's a death sentence. You've seen what it does to people, to everything." Lyra's expression didn't waver. She stepped closer, her eyes locking with his. "I've survived worse," she said, "and so have you. If we're careful, we can make it through. But if we don't take this risk, we're dead anyway." "The Scavengers don't take prisoners, Kael, you know that." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. Kael glanced back the way they'd come, half expecting to see dust rising in the distance, signaling the approach of their pursuers. The wasteland was relentless, and every decision carried the weight of life or death. He exhaled sharply, his hand brushing the hilt of his knife. "All right," he muttered. "But if we're doing this, we move fast, no stops, no detours." Lyra nodded, a flicker of relief crossing her face before she turned and started toward the path. Kael followed, his senses on high alert. The ground beneath their feet shifted from dry, crumbling earth to a strange, ashen texture that seemed to cling to their boots. The air grew heavier, tinged with a metallic tang that burned the back of his throat. In the distance, the skeletal remains of ancient structures loomed, their jagged outlines silhouetted against the dimming sky. It was a place where time itself seemed to have decayed. As they pressed deeper into the zone, the silence became oppressive. No birds sang, no insects buzzed, just the crunch of their footsteps and the occasional creak of rusted metal swaying in the wind. Kael's eyes darted to every shadow, every flicker of movement. He'd heard tales of the creatures that lurked here, twisted by the radiation into something unrecognizable. His grip tightened on his weapon as they passed a rusted-out vehicle, its windows shattered and its interior filled with skeletal remains. Lyra moved with purpose, her steps quick and deliberate. She seemed unfazed by the eerie surroundings, her focus locked on the path ahead. But Kael couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see glowing eyes or the glint of a predator's teeth. The tension between them was palpable, their uneasy alliance stretched thin by the weight of the decision they'd made. "Keep up," Lyra said sharply, her voice cutting through the silence. "We're almost through." Kael didn't respond, his mind racing. He trusted her instinct. She'd saved his life more than once, but this felt different. The stakes were higher, the risks more unpredictable. He couldn't shake the image of what might be waiting for them in the shadows, or what might happen if the radiation took hold before they reached the other side. But he also knew they had no other choice. The wasteland didn't forgive hesitation, and neither did the Scavengers. As they pressed on, the faint hum of machinery reached Kael's ears, a sound so out of place in the desolation that it made him pause. Lyra stopped too, her head tilting as she listened. "What is that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lyra's eyes narrowed. "I don't know," she admitted. "But we're not sticking around to find out. Let's move." The unease between them grew as the sound grew louder, mingling with the oppressive silence of the zone. Kael's heart pounded in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But Lyra was already moving, her determination unyielding. He followed, his hand gripping his knife as they ventured deeper into the unknown, the radioactive wasteland stretching out before them like a gauntlet they had no choice but to run. The air in the radioactive zone was thick with an unnatural stillness, broken only by the faint hum of Geiger counters strapped to Kael and Lyra's belts. The landscape stretched before them, a jagged wasteland of twisted metal and crumbling ruins, bathed in an eerie green glow from the irradiated haze. Every step felt precarious, every shadow a potential threat. Kael moved with the precision of someone who had spent years surviving in this hostile world, his eyes scanning the terrain for danger. Lyra, though skilled, was visibly tense, her grip tightening on the hilt of her knife as they pressed forward. It was the sound that came first, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath their feet. Kael froze, raising a hand to signal Lyra to stop. The growl grew louder, accompanied by the crunch of heavy paws on broken glass and debris. From the shadows emerged the Pack-Mutated wolves, their once familiar forms now grotesquely distorted. Their fur was patchy and matted, their eyes glowing with an unnatural yellow light. Jaws lined with jagged, oversized teeth dripped with saliva, and their movements were unnervingly fluid, as if the radiation had warped their very biology. Kael's mind raced. He knew these creatures were faster, stronger, and far more aggressive than their pre-apocalyptic counterparts. "Stay close," he muttered to Lyra, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "They hunt in packs and they don't give up easily." The wolves circled them, their growls escalating into snarls. Lyra's breath quickened, her knuckles white as she gripped her weapon. "We can't outrun them," she whispered, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay composed. Before Kael could respond, the largest of the wolves lunged, its massive form barreling toward Lyra with terrifying speed. She barely had time to raise her knife, but the creature's sheer force knocked her to the ground. Kael acted without hesitation. He swung his machete in a wide arc, the blade slicing through the air and connecting with the wolf's flank. The creature howled in pain, retreating momentarily, but the others closed in, emboldened by their leader's attack. Kael positioned himself between Lyra and the pack, his movements precise and deliberate. He knew one wrong move could mean the end for both of them. "Get up," he barked, his tone leaving no room for argument. Lyra scrambled to her feet, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and determination. The wolves lunged again, and this time Kael and Lyra fought back in unison. Kael's machete cut through the air with deadly accuracy, while Lyra's knife found its mark in the throat of a smaller wolf that tried to flank them. But the pack was relentless. Another wolf charged at Lyra, its jaws snapping inches from her face. Kael saw the danger before she did. He shoved her out of the way, taking the brunt of the attack himself. The wolf's teeth grazed his arm, tearing through his jacket and drawing blood. Ignoring the pain, Kael drove his blade into the creature's skull, ending its life with a single, brutal strike. The remaining wolves hesitated, their pack instinct faltering in the face of Kael's ferocity. With a final, menacing growl, they retreated into the shadows, leaving the two survivors standing amidst the carnage. Kael's chest heaved as he caught his breath, his eyes darting to ensure the threat was truly gone. Lyra stared at him, her expression a mix of shock and gratitude. You saved me," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think you'd risk your life for me." Kael wiped the blood from his blade, his expression unreadable. "We're a team now," he said simply, his tone leaving no room for further discussion. "You watch my back, I watch yours. That's how we survive." Lyra nodded, though her hands still trembled. The encounter had shaken her, but it had also forged a new understanding between them. Kael's actions had spoken louder than words, proving that, in this unforgiving world, trust was a rare and precious commodity. As they continued their journey, the weight of that trust hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. The wasteland had tested them, and for now they had emerged stronger together. Emerging from the radioactive zone, Kael and Lyra moved cautiously, their senses on high alert. The air still carried a faint metallic tang, a lingering reminder of the irradiated wasteland they had just escaped. Their bodies ached, their supplies were dwindling, and the relentless sun bore down on them without mercy. But as they crested a rise in the terrain, their eyes caught sight of something unexpected, a cluster of crumbling buildings, their outlines softened by years of neglect. It was an abandoned settlement, a ghostly echo of a time before the world had turned to ash. The settlement was eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of rusted metal and the whisper of wind through broken windows. Kael motioned for Lyra to stay close as they approached, scanning the area for any signs of movement. The place had clearly been picked over by scavengers long ago, but as they ventured deeper, they noticed something that made their hearts race: a vehicle, partially hidden beneath a tarp, its tires still intact. It was an old truck, its paint peeling and its frame battered, but it looked functional. For the first time in days, a flicker of hope ignited in their chests. Kael wasted no time. He pulled back the tarp, revealing the truck's dashboard and steering wheel. "This could be our way out," he muttered, his voice tinged with both excitement and caution. Lyra nodded, her eyes darting around the area as she kept watch. Kael crouched beside the driver's side door, pulling out a set of tools from his pack. Hotwiring a vehicle was a skill he'd picked up in the early days of the collapse, and though it had been years since he'd last done it, the motions came back to him with muscle memory. He pried open the panel beneath the steering column, his fingers working quickly to expose the wires. But just as he was about to connect the final wires, a sharp whistle pierced the air. Lyra spun around, her hand flying to the knife at her belt. "Kael," she hissed, her voice low and urgent. "We've got company." From the shadows of the surrounding buildings, figures began to emerge, scavengers, their faces obscured by makeshift masks and their hands gripping an assortment of weapons. They moved with predatory precision, their eyes locked on Kael and Lyra. The two survivors exchanged a glance, their unspoken communication saying everything. There was no time to finish hotwiring the truck. They had to move. Kael slammed the panel shut and grabbed his pack, slinging it over his shoulder as Lyra pulled him to his feet. "This way," she whispered, pointing toward a narrow alley between two crumbling structures. They broke into a sprint, their boots kicking up dust as they darted through the maze of debris and broken walls. Behind them, the scavengers gave chase, their shouts echoing through the empty streets. The settlement became a blur of shattered glass and rusted metal as Kael and Lyra weaved through the ruins. Their lungs burned, but they couldn't stop, not now, not when the scavengers were so close. Lyra led them toward the edge of the settlement, where the buildings gave way to open ground. The truck was lost to them, but survival was all that mattered. As they burst out into the open, the scavengers' voices grew faint, their pursuit faltering as the distance widened. Kael and Lyra didn't slow down until the settlement was nothing more than a smudge on the horizon. They collapsed behind a cluster of boulders, their chests heaving as they tried to catch their breath. The truck was gone, but they were alive. For now, that was enough. Lyra leaned back against the rocks, her eyes scanning the horizon. "We'll find another way," she said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion. Kael nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant shapes of the scavengers retreating back into the settlement. The road ahead was uncertain, but they had faced worse. Together, they would keep moving forward, one step at a time. The wind howled through the skeletal remains of the skyscraper, its shattered windows offering little protection against the biting cold. Kael and Lyra moved cautiously through the dim, debris-strewn halls, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The building groaned under the weight of its own decay, a reminder of the world that had crumbled long before they were born. But amidst the ruins, there was hope, something that could change everything. It was Lyra who spotted it first, her sharp eyes catching the glint of aged parchment beneath a pile of rusted metal. She knelt, brushing aside the debris with careful hands. The map was fragile, its edges frayed and ink faded, but its significance was immediately clear. It depicted a route, a path to the energy core, the legendary source of power that could restore life to the wasteland. For a moment, they both stared in silence, the weight of the discovery pressing down on them. But as Lyra traced the lines with her finger, her excitement faltered. The map was incomplete. A crucial section near the end was missing, torn away by time or perhaps by design. "We're so close," she murmured, frustration creeping into her voice. "This could be the key to everything, but without the missing piece, it's useless." Kael frowned, studying the map over her shoulder. "Do you think it was torn off intentionally, or did it just decay over time?" Lyra shook her head. "I don't think this is an accident. Look here, the tear is too clean. Someone wanted to hide this part of the map, and if I had to guess, that someone was a scavenger." The mention of the scavengers sent a chill through Kael. They were a ruthless faction, known for hoarding technology and resources, and they didn't take kindly to outsiders. If the missing piece of the map was in their hands, retrieving it would be no small feat. But Lyra's determination was unwavering. "There's a stronghold not far from here," she said, her voice steady. "If anyone has the missing piece, it's them." Kael hesitated, glancing at the map and then at Lyra. "You're talking about infiltrating a scavenger stronghold." "That's suicide. They'll kill us on sight." Lyra met his gaze, her eyes fierce. "We don't have a choice. This map is the closest we've ever been to finding the energy core. If we don't take the risk, someone else will. And if the scavengers figure out what they have, they'll use it for themselves. We can't let that happen." The gravity of her words settled over them. The energy core wasn't just a source of power. It was a symbol of hope, a chance to rebuild what had been lost. But it was also a weapon, one that could tip the balance of power in the wasteland. If the scavengers controlled it, the fragile alliances that kept the survivors alive would shatter. Kael exhaled slowly, his mind racing. "All right," he said finally, "but we'll need a plan. We can't just walk in there and expect to find the missing piece." "Scavengers don't leave anything unguarded." Lyra nodded, already thinking ahead. We'll need to scout the stronghold first, find their weak points, and we'll need disguises, something to blend in. If we're lucky, we can get in and out without anyone noticing. As they prepared to leave the skyscraper, the map carefully folded and tucked into Lyra's pack, Kael couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to him. The Scavenger stronghold was a fortress, and they were walking into the lion's den. But as he looked at Lyra, her resolve unwavering, he knew there was no turning back. The energy core was out there, and so was the missing piece of the map. They had come too far to give up now. The sun was setting as they stepped out of the skyscraper, casting long shadows across the ruins. Somewhere in the distance, the glow of the Scavenger stronghold was just visible on the horizon. It was a daunting sight, but for the first time in weeks, Kael felt a flicker of hope. They had a lead, a chance to change the course of their lives, and the lives of everyone in the wasteland. All they had to do was survive the night. Kael's jaw tightened as he weighed the risks. Infiltrating the Scavenger stronghold wasn't just dangerous, it was borderline suicidal. But with Lyra's quiet insistence and the fate of humanity hanging in the balance, he had little choice. The dim glow of their makeshift campfire flickered across her face, casting shadows that mirrored the unease in her eyes. If they succeed, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling flames, humanity is finished. The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Kael nodded, his resolve hardening. They moved under the cover of darkness, their footsteps muffled by the eerie silence of the wasteland. The stronghold loomed ahead, a jagged silhouette against the starless sky. Its walls were patched together from scavenged metal and crumbling concrete, a testament to the Scavengers' resourcefulness and their ruthlessness. As they crept closer, the faint hum of voices reached their ears. Kael and Lyra exchanged a glance, their communication silent but understood. They slipped through a gap in the perimeter, their movements precise and deliberate. Inside, the air was thick with the acrid smell of rust and sweat. The corridors were dimly lit, the flicker of oil lamps casting long, wavering shadows. Every step felt like a gamble, every breath a risk. The voices grew louder, more distinct. Kael pressed himself against a wall, his heart pounding as he peered around the corner. A group of scavengers stood gathered in a makeshift war room, their faces illuminated by the glow of a holographic map. Kael's eyes widened as he recognized the markings. The orbital colony, Lyra, was clearly marked as their target. The Scavengers were planning an attack, and from the sound of it, they weren't just aiming to raid. They intended to destroy. Lyra's hand gripped his arm, her fingers trembling slightly. "Do you hear that?" she murmured, her voice barely a breath. "They're talking about overloading the colony's reactor. If they pull this off, the explosion will wipe out everything Lyra, the surrounding settlements, even the atmosphere could be destabilized." Kael's mind raced. This wasn't just a raid, it was an extinction-level event. The Scavengers had always been ruthless, but this was something else entirely. He glanced at Lyra, her face pale but determined. They had to act, and fast, but first they needed proof, something to rally the remaining colonies, to show them the threat was real. As the Scavengers continued their discussion, Kael noticed something glinting on a nearby table. His breath caught. It was the missing piece of the map, the one they'd been searching for. The piece that could lead them to the Ark, humanity's last hope for survival. He gestured to Lyra, who nodded in silent understanding. While she kept watch, Kael inched forward, his movements slow and deliberate. Every second felt like an eternity, every sound a potential alarm. Finally, his fingers closed around the map piece. He tucked it into his pack, his heart pounding with a mix of relief and dread. They had what they came for, but the stakes had just gotten higher. As they slipped back into the shadows, Lyra's whisper echoed in his mind. If they succeed, humanity is finished. The weight of those words pressed down on him as they made their escape. The Scavengers' plan was horrifying, but now they had the means to stop it. The map piece was more than just a relic, it was a lifeline, and as Kael and Lyra disappeared into the night, the race to save what remained of humanity had only just begun. The air was thick with the acrid smell of rust and decay as Kael and Lyra sprinted through the labyrinthine ruins of the Stronghold. Behind them, the echoing shouts of Scavengers grew louder, their guttural voices bouncing off the crumbling walls. Kael's heart pounded in his chest, each step a desperate bid for freedom. Lyra, breathing hard, glanced over her shoulder, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and determination. "They're gaining on us," she hissed, her voice barely audible over the chaos. Kael's mind raced, scanning the environment for anything that could buy them time. The Scavengers were relentless, their footsteps heavy and purposeful. He knew they couldn't outrun them forever. His eyes darted to a jagged fissure in the wall ahead, partially obscured by a tangle of corroded metal beams. It was a risk, but it might be their only chance. This way, he barked, grabbing Lyra's arm and pulling her toward the narrow opening. The fissure led into a hidden tunnel, its entrance barely wide enough for them to squeeze through. Kael ducked inside first, his body scraping against the rough edges of the passage. Lyra followed, her movements swift but cautious. The tunnel was dark, the only light coming from faint cracks in the ceiling. Cobwebs clung to their faces and the air was damp and stale, but it was a refuge for now. As they moved deeper, the sound of the Scavengers faded, muffled by the thick walls of the tunnel. Lyra paused, leaning against the cold stone to catch her breath. "Where does this lead?" she asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Kael didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pack and pulled out a small, battered device, a relic from his days as a scavenger himself. It was a crude compass, its needle flickering faintly in the dim light. He studied it for a moment, then nodded. "It's an old supply route," he said finally, "used by traders before the collapse. If we follow it, we should come out near the river." Lyra raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a half-smile. "You're full of surprises," she said, her tone lighter now, though her eyes still held a glimmer of caution. "How do you know about this place?" Kael shrugged, his expression unreadable. "I've spent a lot of time in the wastelands. You learn to notice things others miss." He didn't elaborate, but the weight of his words hung in the air. It was clear that his knowledge came from years of survival, of scraping by in a world that offered no second chances. They pressed on, the tunnel twisting and turning like the veins of some ancient beast. The walls were lined with faded symbols and markings, remnants of a time when this passage had been a lifeline for those who dared to traverse the wastelands. Kael traced his fingers over one of the symbols, his touch almost reverent. "These were warnings," he murmured, telling travelers where to find water, where to avoid the toxic zones. Lyra studied the markings, her curiosity piqued. "It's like a map," she said softly. "A guide for the lost." Kael nodded. Back then, people looked out for each other. Shared what they knew. Now, his voice trailed off and he shook his head as if dispelling the thought. Now it's every man for himself. The tunnel began to slope upward, the air growing fresher with each step. Ahead, a faint glimmer of light signaled the exit. Kael quickened his pace, his senses on high alert. They were close now, but the danger wasn't over. The Scavengers might not have followed them into the tunnel, but they would be waiting, watching for any sign of movement. As they reached the exit, Kael held up a hand, signaling for Lyra to stop. He peered out cautiously, scanning the area for any signs of life. The river was just ahead, its waters glinting in the pale sunlight. Beyond it, the wastelands stretched endlessly, a desolate expanse of cracked earth and skeletal trees. It was a harsh and unforgiving landscape, but it was also their best chance at survival. "Stay close," Kael said, his voice low and steady. "We're not out of this yet." Lyra nodded, her grip tightening on the makeshift weapon she carried. Together, they stepped out into the open, their movements deliberate and silent. The scavengers were out there somewhere, but for now, they had the advantage. And as they moved toward the river, Lyra couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Kael's knowledge of the wastelands had saved them once. She had a feeling it would save them again. Kael and Lyra stood at the edge of the desolate wasteland, the map clutched tightly in Kael's gloved hand. The path ahead was marked by jagged cliffs and endless dunes, a treacherous route that promised both danger and hope. The energy core's location was finally within their grasp, a beacon of salvation in a world that had long since crumbled. But as they stepped forward, the horizon darkened and the air grew heavy with the scent of impending chaos. A massive sandstorm, a force of nature as relentless as the wasteland itself, began to churn in the distance, its swirling tendrils reaching out like the fingers of a giant. The wind howled, carrying with it the sharp bite of sand and grit. Kael shouted over the roar, his voice barely audible. "We need shelter now." Lyra nodded, her eyes scanning the barren landscape. The storm was moving fast, too fast to outrun. Their only chance was to find cover before the full force of it hit. Through the haze, Lyra spotted the faint outline of a structure, a relic from the old world half buried in the sand. There, she pointed, her voice urgent. They raced toward it, the storm closing in behind them. The structure revealed itself to be an ancient underground facility, its entrance partially obscured by debris and time. Kael pried open the rusted metal door, its hinges groaning in protest, and they tumbled inside just as the storm engulfed the surface. The door slammed shut behind them, plunging them into darkness. For a moment, all they could hear was the muffled roar of the storm outside and the sound of their own breathing. Lyra activated her wrist-mounted light, the soft glow illuminating their surroundings. The facility was a labyrinth of crumbling concrete and rusted machinery, a ghostly reminder of a civilization that had once thrived. The air was stale, thick with the scent of decay and metal. Kael took a cautious step forward, his boots crunching on broken glass. "This place hasn't been touched in decades," he muttered, his voice echoing in the vast emptiness. As they ventured deeper, the facility began to reveal its secrets. Walls lined with faded diagrams and cryptic symbols hinted at its original purpose. Lyra paused, her light tracing the outline of a massive generator. "This wasn't just any facility," she said, her tone a mix of awe and unease. "It was a research station, maybe even a testing ground for the energy core itself." Kael's eyes narrowed as he stepped closer to the generator. The storm outside might have been a stroke of luck, forcing them into a place that could hold answers they hadn't even known to seek. If they were working on the energy core here, there might be data, something that could help us understand how to stabilize it, he said, his voice low but filled with determination. The two of them began to search, their movements quick but deliberate. The facility was a maze of corridors and chambers, each one holding the potential for discovery or danger. As they worked, the storm raged on above, its fury a constant reminder of the unforgiving world outside. But within the walls of the ancient facility, Kael and Lyra found something else, a glimmer of hope, a thread of knowledge that could change everything. The deeper they went, the more the facility seemed to come alive, as if it had been waiting for them. Strange lights flickered in the distance, and the hum of long-dormant machinery began to fill the air. It was as though the past and present were colliding, and Kael and Lyra were caught in the middle, their journey now intertwined with the secrets of a world long gone. The storm had forced them into shelter, but it had also led them to a place where the answers they sought might finally be within reach. And as they pressed on, the weight of their mission grew heavier, the stakes higher than ever. The energy core was no longer just a goal, it was a key to understanding the past and shaping the future. and in the heart of the ancient facility, Kael and Lyra knew they were one step closer to unlocking its power. As Kael and Lyra stepped deeper into the facility, the air grew colder, heavy with the scent of dust and decay. The walls, once sleek and metallic, were now corroded and stained by time. Flickering lights cast eerie shadows, illuminating remnants of a world long gone. In the center of the room, a strange machine hummed faintly, its surface covered in a layer of grime. Kael ran a hand over it, and suddenly the room came alive. A holographic projection sparked to life, bathing the space in a pale blue glow. The figure that materialized was unmistakable Kael's father, Dr. Elias Vaya. His face was stern but kind, his voice steady despite the years that had passed since his death. Kael's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't seen his father's face in years, not since the day he disappeared into the wastelands, leaving behind only a cryptic note and a lifetime of unanswered questions. The hologram began to speak, its voice echoing through the chamber. "If you're seeing this, Kael, it means you've found the facility. And if you've come this far, you must know by now that the energy core isn't just a relic. It's the key to understanding what went wrong." The recording continued, revealing a story that sent chills down their spines. Decades before the collapse, the government had launched a secret initiative codenamed Project Eden. Its goal was ambitious: to terraform the wastelands, turning the barren, irradiated landscapes into fertile, habitable land. The energy core was the heart of this project, designed to power massive atmospheric processes that could cleanse the air and soil. But the project was doomed from the start. The core's power was unstable, and the scientists underestimated the complexity of the ecosystems they were trying to rebuild. When the core was activated for the first time, it overloaded, triggering a catastrophic chain reaction. The resulting energy surge not only destroyed the facility, but also unleashed a wave of radiation that spread across the region, accelerating the collapse of nearby settlements. Lyra's eyes widened as she processed the information. So the core wasn't just a weapon or a power source. It was meant to save us, but it ended up making everything worse. Kael nodded, his mind racing. The weight of his father's words settled heavily on his shoulders. Dr. Vaya had been one of the lead scientists on Project Eden, and his guilt over the failure was palpable even in the recording. "We thought we were playing God," the hologram continued, "but we were only children playing with fire. The core is dangerous, Kael. It's not just a tool, it's a reminder of our hubris. If it falls into the wrong hands, the consequences could be unimaginable." The hologram flickered, its image distorting as the machine's power began to wane. Before it faded completely, Dr. Vaya's voice grew softer, almost pleading. "Find the core, Kael, but don't use it, destroy it. It's the only way to prevent history from repeating itself." With that, the projection dissolved, leaving the room in silence once more. Kael stood frozen, his father's words echoing in his mind. For years, he had searched for answers, driven by a need to understand why his father had left. Now he had them, and they were far more complicated than he had ever imagined. Lyra placed a hand on his shoulder, pulling him back to the present. "We need to decide what to do next," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "If the core is as dangerous as your father says, we can't let anyone else find it, but destroying it won't be easy." Kael nodded, his resolve hardening. They had come this far, and there was no turning back. The wastelands were a harsh and unforgiving place, but they were also full of secrets that could either save or doom what remained of humanity. As they turned to leave the facility, Kael couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was only just beginning. The energy core was out there somewhere, and the race to find it or destroy it was on. Kael's steps faltered as the weight of Lyra's words settled over him. The revelation about the core, its potential to either save or destroy everything they'd fought for, left him grappling with doubt. His mind raced, replaying the countless lives lost, the sacrifices made, and the fragile hope they'd clung to. Was this core truly worth the risk? Could they gamble what little remained of humanity's future on something so volatile? His voice, barely above a whisper, broke the silence. Lyra, this could end us. Everything we've built, everything we've fought for, gone in an instant. How can we justify that? Lyra paused, her hand resting on the cold, rusted wall of the corridor. Her gaze, usually sharp and unwavering, softened as she turned to face him. It's not just about power, Kael. It's about redemption. For all of it, the mistakes, the losses, the choices we couldn't take back. This core, it's a chance to make things right. Not just for us, but for everyone who didn't make it this far. Her voice carried a quiet intensity, the kind that came from years of carrying burdens too heavy to share. I know the risks, I feel them too, but if we don't try, if we walk away now, we're no better than the ones who let the world burn. The dim light of their flickering lanterns cast long shadows on the walls, making the facility's labyrinthine corridors feel even more oppressive. Every step deeper into the facility seemed to echo with the ghosts of the past, machines long dormant, their wires hanging like veins, and faded signs warning of dangers they could no longer fully comprehend. Kael's boots scuffed against the cracked floor, the sound a steady rhythm that matched the pounding of his heart. He wanted to argue, to challenge her, but the conviction in her words left him with nothing but silence. As they pressed forward, the air grew heavier, thick with the scent of rust and decay. The facility, once a marvel of human ingenuity, now felt like a tomb, a monument to a civilization that had reached too far, too fast. Kael couldn't help but wonder if they were walking the same path. Redemption, he muttered, the word tasting bitter on his tongue. What if we're just repeating their mistakes? What if this is another step toward the same end? Lyra didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stopped at a junction, her eyes scanning the faded map etched into the wall. Her finger traced a path, hesitating at a point marked with a symbol neither of them recognized. Maybe we are, she admitted, her tone softer now. But isn't that the point? To learn from their failures, to do what they couldn't. We've seen what happens when fear wins, when people stop believing in second chances. I'm not saying it'll be easy, but if there's even a sliver of hope, isn't it worth fighting for? Kael's shoulders sagged, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He wanted to believe her, to cling to the idea that they could make a difference. But the scars of the past ran deep, and the fear of failure was a shadow he couldn't shake. And if we're wrong, he asked, his voice barely audible. If this core is just another weapon, another way for someone to control what's left. Lyra turned to him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. Then we'll face that too, together, but we can't let fear decide our future, not again. She reached out, her hand brushing against his arm. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of everything they'd been through, the battles fought, the trust built, the unspoken bond that had kept them alive this long. We've come too far to turn back now. The corridor ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, a maze of steel and shadows that mirrored the uncertainty in Kael's mind. But as he looked at Lyra, her resolve unwavering even in the face of the unknown, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It wasn't the bright, blinding kind, but a fragile, hesitant spark, one that whispered of possibilities instead of despair. With a deep breath, Kael nodded, his decision made. "All right," he said, his voice steadier now. "Let's see this through, for redemption, for them." He gestured vaguely toward the past, toward the faces and names they carried with them. Lyra's lips curved into a faint smile, and without another word, they moved forward, their footsteps echoing in unison through the silent, decaying corridors. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with dangers they couldn't yet see, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Kael allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to make things right. The air was thick with the hum of machinery as Kael and Lyra moved cautiously through the ruins of an old industrial complex. The walls were lined with rusted pipes and flickering light panels, casting eerie shadows that danced across the floor. It was supposed to be a quick scavenging run, just another day in the wasteland, but fate had other plans. Suddenly, the sharp whir of spinning blades cut through the silence, and a security drone emerged from the shadows, its red optic sensor locking onto them with unrelenting precision. The drone was a relic from before the collapse, its once polished frame now scarred and weathered, but its weapon systems were still very much operational. Before either of them could react, it unleashed a burst of energy bolts, narrowly missing Lyra as she dove behind a crumbling pillar. Kael scrambled for cover, his heart pounding as he assessed the situation. "We need to take it down before it calls for reinforcements," he shouted over the drone's mechanical screech. Lyra nodded, her eyes narrowing as she studied the drone's movements. "It's got a weak point near the base of its rotor. If we can hit it just right, we might be able to disable it." She glanced at Kael, her expression a mix of determination and urgency. "But we'll need to distract it first." Without hesitation, Kael sprang into action, grabbing a piece of debris and hurling it at the drone. The makeshift projectile struck its casing, drawing its attention away from Lyra. The drone pivoted, its weapons charging as it zeroed in on Kael. He ducked behind a metal crate, the energy bolts scorching the air where he had just been standing. "Any time now, Lyra," he called out, his voice strained but steady. Lyra moved swiftly, using the drone's momentary distraction to her advantage. She pulled a small EMP device from her pack, a rare and valuable piece of tech she'd been saving for an emergency. As the drone turned back toward her, she activated the device and hurled it with precision, aiming for the vulnerable spot she'd identified earlier. The EMP detonated with a crackling burst of energy, and the drone's systems flickered and sputtered before it crashed to the ground in a heap of sparking wires and broken metal. For a moment, the only sound was their heavy breathing as the tension began to fade. Kael stepped out from behind the crate, a grin spreading across his face. "Guess we make a good team after all," he quipped, his tone light but sincere. Lyra couldn't help but smile in return, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. "Don't get used to it," she replied, though there was a hint of warmth in her voice that hadn't been there before. As they caught their breath, the weight of what had just happened settled over them. It wasn't just about surviving the drone. It was about the trust they'd built in those frantic moments. Kael had put his life on the line to buy her time, and Lyra had used her skills and resourcefulness to neutralize the threat. Together, they'd turned a potential disaster into a victory, and in doing so, they'd taken another step toward becoming more than just two people thrown together by circumstance. The experience left them with a newfound respect for each other, a silent acknowledgement that they were stronger together than apart. As they continued through the complex, the air between them felt lighter, the tension of their earlier disagreements replaced by a sense of camaraderie. The wasteland was full of dangers, but for the first time, they both felt a little less alone in facing them. Exiting the facility, Kael and Lyra stepped into the harsh light of the wasteland, the air thick with the scent of dust and decay. Ahead of them stretched a jagged canyon, its depth shrouded in shadows that seemed to pulse with an almost sentient menace. The ground beneath their feet crumbled at the edges, a stark reminder of the instability of this shattered world. Lyra hesitated, her sharp eyes scanning the narrow path that wound along the canyon's edge. It was barely wide enough for a single person, the drop on either side plunging into an abyss that seemed to yawn wider with every step. Kael moved first, his boots crunching against the loose gravel as he tested the path's stability. "Stay close," he muttered, his voice low but firm. Lyra followed, her movements cautious but deliberate, her fingers brushing the rough stone wall to her left for balance. The wind howled through the canyon, carrying with it the faint, metallic tang of rusted metal and the distant cries of scavenger birds. It was a sound that set Lyra's nerves on edge, but she pushed forward, her focus locked on Kael's back as he led the way. The path narrowed further, the ground beneath them growing more unstable with each step. Lyra's foot slipped on a loose rock, and for a heart-stopping moment, she teetered on the edge, her arms flailing as she tried to regain her balance. A strangled gasp escaped her lips as she felt the ground give way beneath her, the world tilting as she began to fall. Time seemed to slow, the canyon walls blurring into streaks of gray and brown as she reached out instinctively, her fingers clawing at the air. Kael's hand shot out, his grip iron strong as he seized her wrist just before she could plummet into the void. His muscles strained as he hauled her back onto the path, their bodies colliding in a tangle of relief and adrenaline. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the only sound the rapid pounding of their hearts and the distant echo of the wind. Then Kael's voice broke the silence, trembling but resolute. "I'm not losing anyone else," he said, the words heavy with a weight that went far beyond the immediate danger. Lyra looked up at him, her breath still coming in shallow gasps. There was something in his eyes, a flicker of pain, of loss that she hadn't seen before. She didn't ask, not yet, but she filed it away, another piece of the puzzle that was Kael. He released her wrist, his hand lingering for a moment as if to reassure himself that she was still there, still alive. Then he turned back to the path, his shoulders set with a determination that brooked no argument. "Let's keep moving," he said, his voice steadier now. "This canyon isn't going to cross itself." Lyra nodded, her own resolve hardening as she followed him. The encounter had shaken her, but it had also reminded her of the stakes. This world didn't forgive mistakes, and every step they took was a gamble against its unrelenting cruelty. As they continued along the precarious path, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that the canyon was watching them, its jagged walls like the teeth of some ancient predator waiting to swallow them whole. But for now, they pressed on, the bond between them stronger than ever, forged in the crucible of survival. The air was thick with tension as Kael and Lyra cautiously made their way across the desolate canyon floor, their boots crunching over loose gravel and shattered remnants of a world long gone. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly across the barren landscape. They had been on edge for days, knowing the scavengers were never far behind. Just as they reached the halfway point of the canyon, the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against stone echoed through the air. Kael froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the makeshift blade at his side. Lyra's eyes darted to the ridge above where shadowy figures began to emerge, their silhouettes menacing against the fading light. It happened in a flash. A hail of crude projectiles rained down from above, forcing Kael and Lyra to dive for cover behind a cluster of jagged rocks. The scavengers were relentless, their guttural shouts filling the canyon as they closed in. Kael's mind raced, searching for a way out, but the odds were against them. Just as the first wave of attackers reached the base of the ridge, a sudden eruption of gunfire shattered the chaos. Kael and Lyra exchanged a quick, bewildered glance before peering out from their cover. A group of strangers had appeared seemingly out of nowhere, their movements swift and coordinated. They moved with a precision that spoke of experience, their weapons aimed with deadly accuracy. The scavengers, caught off guard, faltered and began to retreat, their cries of fury turning to panic. Kael and Lyra stayed low, watching as the newcomers drove the attackers back into the shadows. When the dust settled, one of the strangers approached, a tall figure with weathered skin and piercing eyes. "You're lucky we were nearby," the man said, his voice steady but carrying an edge of caution. "The scavengers don't take kindly to trespassers in their territory." Kael nodded, still catching his breath. "We owe you our lives. Who are you?" The man introduced himself as Jack, the leader of a nomadic group that had been wandering the wasteland for years. Unlike the Scavengers, who thrived on chaos and destruction, Jack's people survived by sticking together and helping others when they could. "We've seen what the Scavengers do," Jack explained, his tone darkening. "They take everything: food, supplies, even people. We've lost too many to their raids. Helping you was as much about stopping them as it was about saving you." Lyra stepped forward, her voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. "We're grateful, truly, but why risk yourselves for strangers?" Jack's expression softened slightly. "Out here, trust is rare, but if we don't look out for each other, the wasteland will swallow us all. Come with us. We have a camp nearby. It's not much, but it's safer than being out in the open." Reluctantly, Kael and Lyra agreed. As they followed Jack and his group through the winding canyon, the tension began to ease. The nomads shared what little they had: water, dried rations, and a few moments of rest. Around a small fire, Jack recounted stories of their struggles and victories, painting a vivid picture of life in the wasteland. His people had no permanent home, no guarantees of safety, but they had each other. And in a world where survival often meant solitude, that bond was everything. For the first time in weeks, Kael and Lyra felt a glimmer of hope. The nomads' camp was a stark contrast to the chaos they had faced, a makeshift sanctuary of tents and salvaged materials, guarded by a perimeter of watchful eyes. As night fell, the group shared a simple meal, their laughter a rare sound in the otherwise silent wasteland. But even as they settled into the temporary refuge, Kael couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was far from over. The Scavengers would regroup, and the wasteland held countless dangers yet unseen. Still, for now, they were safe, and in a world where survival was a daily battle, that was enough. The tension in the air thickened as the nomads leaned in closer, their voices low and urgent. "We've been watching them," one of them said, his weathered face etched with concern. "The Scavengers, they've been moving in patterns, gathering their forces, and now they're headed straight for the energy core. It's not just a raid, it's a full-scale assault." Kael's jaw tightened, his mind racing through the implications. The energy core was more than just a relic of the old world. It was the key to survival, a beacon of hope in a land ravaged by chaos. If the Scavengers reached it first, everything they'd fought for would be lost. Lyra's hand instinctively went to the hilt of her blade, her knuckles whitening as she gripped it. "We're running out of time," she muttered, her voice barely audible but heavy with resolve. Her words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the stakes. The nomads nodded in grim agreement, their eyes reflecting the same urgency. They had seen the aftermath of the Scavengers' raids. Entire settlements reduced to ash, resources pillaged, and lives extinguished without a second thought. This wasn't just about the energy core, it was about survival itself. One of the nomads, a woman with a scar running down her cheek, stepped forward. "We've mapped their routes," she said, unfolding a tattered piece of parchment. The map was crude but detailed, marked with lines and symbols that indicated the Scavengers' movements. "They're taking the fastest paths, cutting through the old ruins and the Valley of Shadows. If they keep this pace, they'll reach the core in less than 2 days." Kael studied the map, his mind working through the possibilities. The Valley of Shadows was treacherous, a place where the terrain shifted unpredictably and dangers lurked in every shadow. But it was also the quickest route, and the Scavengers clearly weren't afraid of risks. Lyra's gaze flicked to Kael, her expression a mix of determination and unease. "If we take the high pass, we might be able to cut them off," she suggested, pointing to a narrow trail that wound through the mountains. "It's risky, but it's our best shot." The nomads exchanged glances, weighing the options. The high pass was known for its brutal winds and unstable footing, but it offered a direct path to the energy core. Time was the enemy now, and every decision carried the weight of potential disaster. As the group deliberated, Kael couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He scanned the horizon, his instincts on high alert. The wasteland was never truly silent, but now it felt unnervingly still, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The Scavengers weren't just a threat, they were a force of destruction, relentless and unyielding, and they were closing in fast. The nomad's leader, a tall man with a voice like gravel, broke the silence. "We'll guide you as far as we can," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "But after that, you're on your own. The Scavengers are too many, too well armed. We can't risk drawing their attention to our people." Kael nodded, understanding the unspoken truth. The nomads had their own survival to think about, their own families to protect. They were already risking much by sharing what they knew. As the group prepared to move out, Lyra turned to Kael, her eyes searching his for reassurance. "We've faced worse," she said quietly, though the edge in her voice betrayed her doubt. Kael met her gaze, his own resolve hardening. They had come too far to turn back now. The energy core was within reach, and with it, the chance to bring light back to a world shrouded in darkness. But the path ahead was fraught with danger, and every step brought them closer to a confrontation they couldn't afford to lose. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of drums echoed, a haunting reminder that the Scavengers were already on the move. Time was slipping through their fingers, and the race to the energy core had begun. Kael and Lyra moved quickly, their boots crunching against the cracked earth as they left the nomad camp behind. The air was thick with urgency, the weight of their mission pressing down on them with every step. Time was no longer a luxury, it was a ticking clock they couldn't afford to ignore. The energy core, their only hope for securing the future, loomed somewhere ahead in the desolate expanse of the wasteland, but the path to it was far from straightforward. The Scavengers, a ruthless faction known for their cunning and cruelty, had left their mark on the terrain. What appeared to be a barren stretch of land was in reality a labyrinth of danger. The first trap came without warning, a sudden snap of wire beneath Lyra's foot, triggering a cascade of jagged metal spikes that shot up from the ground. She barely had time to shout a warning, yanking Kael backward as the spikes embedded themselves into the air where they just stood. Their hearts pounded, the near miss a stark reminder of the stakes. From there, the traps grew more elaborate, tripwires disguised as harmless vines, pressure plates hidden beneath layers of dirt, and even crude explosives rigged to detonate at the slightest disturbance. Each step required caution, their progress slowed to a crawl as they scanned the ground, the trees, even the air for signs of danger. Kael's mechanical arm, a relic of a past battle, hummed faintly as he used its enhanced sensors to detect faint energy signatures from the traps. But even with his advantage, the Scavengers' ingenuity kept them on edge. At one point, they stumbled upon a chilling sight, a skeleton half buried in the dirt, its bones bleached by the sun. A rusted trap, still functional, lay inches from its outstretched hand. It was a grim warning, a reminder of what awaited those who underestimated the Scavengers' ruthlessness. Lyra crouched beside the remains, her voice low as she muttered, "They're not just trying to stop us, they're sending a message." The traps weren't just physical obstacles, they were psychological warfare. Every step forward felt like a gamble, every moment of progress tempered by the fear of what might come next. Kael's analytical mind worked overtime, piecing together patterns and identifying the Scavengers' methods. "They're using our instincts against us," he said, pointing to a tripwire cleverly placed at ankle height. "They know we'll be looking for bigger threats, so they target the small, overlooked details." Lyra, ever the pragmatist, took the lead, her sharp eyes scanning the terrain with a hunter's precision. She moved with a fluid grace, her instincts honed by years of survival in the wasteland. But even her skills were tested when they encountered a trap that defied logic. A series of mirrors reflecting sunlight in such a way that it created blinding flashes, disorienting anyone who approached. It was a trap designed to exploit human vulnerability to turn their own senses against them. As they navigated the maze of hazards, the tension between them grew palpable. Kael's reliance on technology clashed with Lyra's trust in intuition, their differing approaches sparking quiet arguments. "We can't stop for every little thing," Lyra snapped after Kael insisted on analyzing a seemingly harmless patch of ground. "We're running out of time," but Kael held his ground, his voice steady. "If we rush, we die. The Scavengers are counting on us to make mistakes. We can't give them that satisfaction." Their dynamic, though strained, proved to be their greatest asset. Lyra's speed and instinct paired with Kael's precision and caution allowed them to navigate the traps with a careful balance of urgency and care. Each trap they disarmed or avoided brought them closer to their goal, but also deeper into the Scavengers' territory. The air grew heavier, the silence more oppressive, as though the wasteland itself was holding its breath. And then, just as they thought they'd outsmarted the worst of it, they reached the final obstacle, a massive, rusted gate blocking their path. It was adorned with crude symbols, a clear warning to turn back. But turning back wasn't an option. Beyond that gate lay the energy core, and beyond the core, a chance to change everything. Kael and Lyra exchanged a glance, their determination mirrored in each other's eyes. The traps had tested their skills, their patience, and their trust in one another, but they were still standing, still moving forward. The real challenge, they knew, was yet to come. The Scavengers had made their presence known, but this was only the beginning. The air was thick with tension as Kael and Lyra crouched behind a jagged outcropping of rock, their eyes fixed on the heavily armed scavenger patrol pacing near the entrance of the underground vault. The energy core they had risked everything to find was just beyond that entrance, but the path to it was anything but clear. The vault itself loomed like a monolith, its steel doors reinforced with rusted bolts and faded warning signs that spoke of a time long before the world had fallen to ruin. The Scavengers, clad in patchwork armor and wielding an assortment of weapons, moved with a predatory precision that made it clear they weren't just guarding the vault, they were waiting for intruders like Kael and Lyra. Kael's mind raced as he scanned the area, calculating their options. Going in guns blazing wasn't an option. They were outnumbered and outgunned. Stealth was their only chance, but even that came with its own set of risks. He glanced at Lyra, who was already mapping out the patrol's movements with her sharp, analytical gaze. Her fingers traced the edge of her knife, a silent signal that she was ready for whatever came next. Together, they'd faced impossible odds before, but this felt different. The energy core wasn't just a prize, it was the key to survival, not just for them but for the fragile community they had left behind. Lyra leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper. "They've got a pattern," she said, her eyes narrowing as she pointed to the patrol's movements. 2 guards circle the perimeter every 5 minutes, and there's a third stationed at the door. If we can time it right, we might be able to slip through during the gap. Kael nodded, his jaw tightening as he considered her plan. It was risky, but so was every other option they had. The key would be precision. One wrong move, one misstep, and they'd be caught in a firefight they couldn't win. As they waited for the right moment, Kael's thoughts drifted to the stories he'd heard about the vault. It was said to be one of the last remnants of the old world, a place where the technology of the past had been preserved in the hopes of rebuilding the future. But the Scavengers had claimed it as their own, turning it into a fortress and hoarding its secrets. Kael couldn't help but wonder what else they might find inside: supplies, weapons, maybe even answers to questions they hadn't dared to ask. But first, they had to get through the door. The sound of heavy boots crunching on gravel snapped him back to the present. The patrol was moving again, their movements predictable but no less threatening. Kael and Lyra exchanged a quick glance, a silent agreement passing between them. This was it. They'd have to move fast and stay low, using the shadows and the uneven terrain to their advantage. As the guards turned the corner, Kael gave the signal and they darted forward, their movements as fluid and silent as the wind. Every step felt like an eternity, every breath a potential giveaway, but they pressed on, their focus unwavering. They reached the vault's entrance just as the guards began their next circuit, their backs turned for a precious few seconds. Lyra's hands worked quickly, prying open a rusted panel on the side of the door and exposing a maze of wires. Her fingers danced over them, her years of experience with old-world technology guiding her every move. Kael kept watch, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade, ready to strike if they were discovered. The seconds stretched on, each one a test of their nerves, until finally there was a soft click and the door creaked open just enough for them to slip inside. The darkness of the vault enveloped them as the door closed behind them, the faint hum of machinery filling the air. They were in, but the real challenge was only just beginning. Somewhere in the depths of this labyrinth lay the energy core, and with it the hope of a future worth fighting for. But as Kael and Lyra moved deeper into the vault, they couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The Scavengers might have been outside, but whatever waited within these walls could be far more dangerous. The air inside the vault was thick with tension, the faint hum of the energy core resonating through the metallic walls like a heartbeat. Kael and Lyra moved with precision, their footsteps echoing softly as they navigated the labyrinth of abandoned machinery and flickering lights. The diversion had worked. A carefully orchestrated explosion at the far end of the compound had drawn most of the Scavengers away, leaving only a skeleton crew to guard the vault. But even now, time was slipping through their fingers like grains of sand in a desert storm. The energy core sat at the center of the chamber, suspended in a cradle of glowing conduits. Its light pulsed rhythmically, casting eerie shadows across the room. Kael's breath caught in his throat as he approached. He had seen power sources before, but nothing like this. It wasn't just energy, it was raw potential, a force that could either save their world or doom it. Lyra, ever the pragmatist, was already scanning the area for traps, her sharp eyes darting over the control panels and security systems. "This thing's older than anything I've ever seen," she muttered, her voice barely audible over the hum. "But it's active, too active. If we pull it out wrong, we could trigger a chain reaction." Kael nodded, his mind racing. They didn't have the luxury of caution, not with the Scavengers closing in. He reached for the core, his hand trembling slightly as the air around it crackled with static. Just as his fingers brushed the surface, the vault door shuddered violently, the sound of heavy boots and guttural shouts echoing from the corridor outside. "They're here," Lyra hissed, already drawing her weapon. Her voice was calm, but Kael could see the tension in her stance. The Scavengers weren't just opportunists, they were ruthless, driven by desperation and a hunger for power. And now they knew exactly where Kael and Lyra were. The door exploded inward, debris scattering across the floor as a dozen Scavengers poured into the room. Their armor was patched together from salvaged scraps, and their weapons gleamed with cruel efficiency. Kael and Lyra dove for cover behind a stack of crates, the energy core momentarily forgotten as the first volley of gunfire erupted. The firefight was chaotic, a blur of muzzle flashes and shouted commands. Kael's heart pounded as he returned fire, his shots precise but hurried. Lyra, meanwhile, moved with the fluid grace of someone who had been in countless battles. She picked off Scavengers with ruthless efficiency, her every movement calculated and deliberate, but even she couldn't hold them off forever. "We need to get that core and get out of here." Kael shouted over the noise, his voice tinged with desperation. Lyra nodded, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the situation. "Cover me. I'll try to disable the security protocols." Kael didn't need to be told twice. He stepped out from behind cover, firing at the advancing scavengers with everything he had. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning metal, but he forced himself to focus. Every second counted. As Lyra worked feverishly at the control panel, the energy core's glow intensified, the hum growing louder and more erratic. Kael's stomach twisted with dread. They were running out of time, not just to escape the scavengers, but to prevent the core from destabilizing. The stakes had never been higher, and every decision could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. The scavengers were relentless, their numbers seemingly endless, but Kael and Lyra had come too far to fail now. With the core almost within their grasp, they fought not just for their lives, but for the future of a world teetering on the brink of collapse. The air grew heavy with tension as Kael and Lyra clutched the energy core, its faint hum a stark contrast to the ominous silence that followed Draven's words. The Scavenger's leader stepped forward, his silhouette framed by the flickering light of torches that lined the crumbling walls of the abandoned facility. His voice was low, dripping with disdain as he sneered, "You think you can save humanity? Humanity is already dead." Kael's grip tightened on the core, his mind racing. Draven wasn't just a warlord, he was a symbol of the chaos that had consumed the world. His presence alone was enough to send shivers down the spines of even the most hardened survivors. Lyra, ever the strategist, scanned the room, her eyes darting between the exits and the heavily armed scavengers who now surrounded them. "We've faced worse," she muttered under her breath, though the tension in her voice betrayed her confidence. Draven took another step closer, his boots crunching on the broken glass littering the floor. "Do you even know what you're holding?" he asked, his tone mocking. "That core isn't a savior, it's a relic of the old world, a reminder of the arrogance that brought us to this wasteland. You're chasing ghosts clinging to a past that's already burned to ash." Kael's jaw clenched. He had heard this rhetoric before from others who had given up, who believed that survival meant abandoning hope, but he couldn't let Draven's words take root. The energy core wasn't just a tool, it was a symbol of what could still be achieved. "You're wrong," he shot back, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "This isn't about the past, it's about the future, and if you're too blind to see that, then you're the one who's already dead." Draven's laugh was cold, echoing through the hollow chamber. Brave words from a man who's outnumbered and outmatched. Do you really think you can outrun the inevitable? The wasteland doesn't forgive, and it doesn't forget. It consumes everything: hope, dreams, even your precious humanity. Lyra stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You talk about inevitability, but you're just afraid. Afraid of what might happen if people like us actually succeed. If we rebuild, if we rise again, then what's left for you? You're nothing but a parasite feeding off the scraps of a broken world." The room seemed to hold its breath as Draven's expression darkened. For a moment, the mask of arrogance slipped, revealing a flicker of something deeper, fear, perhaps, or even regret. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the cold, calculating gaze of a man who had long since abandoned any semblance of humanity. "Fine," he said, his voice a low growl. "If you want to play the hero, then let's see how far your courage takes you." With a nod, the scavengers moved in, their weapons raised. Kael and Lyra exchanged a glance, their unspoken bond stronger than any words. They had been through too much to give up now. As the first shot rang out, they dove for cover, the energy core still clutched tightly in Kael's hands. The fight was far from over, and in the chaos of battle, one thing became clear. The wasteland might have taken much, but it hadn't taken their will to fight for something better. The air was thick with tension, the hum of the ancient core vibrating through the chamber like a heartbeat on the verge of collapse. Kael wiped the blood from his split lip, his chest heaving as he squared off against Draven. The two men circled each other, their movements deliberate, each step echoing against the metallic walls. Kael's fists were clenched, his knuckles bruised and raw, while Draven's cold, calculating gaze betrayed no emotion, only the promise of violence. Draven struck first, a blur of motion that sent Kael stumbling backward. The impact of Draven's fist against his ribs was like a sledgehammer, knocking the wind out of him. Kael gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay upright, but Draven was relentless. Another blow came, this time to his jaw, sending him crashing to the ground. The metallic taste of blood filled his mouth as he struggled to push himself up, his vision swimming. Across the room, Lyra's hands flew over the control panel, her fingers trembling as she desperately tried to decipher the ancient interface. The core's activation sequence was a labyrinth of symbols and codes, and time was running out. She glanced over her shoulder, her heart sinking as she saw Kael on the floor, Draven standing over him like a predator savoring its prey. "Kael, get up," she screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. Kael's body ached, every muscle screaming in protest as he forced himself to his knees. He met Draven's gaze, defiance burning in his eyes despite the pain. "You think you've won," he spat, blood dripping from his mouth. "This isn't over." Draven smirked, a cruel twist of his lips as he stepped closer. "You're persistent, I'll give you that, but persistence won't save you." He delivered a vicious kick to Kael's side, sending him sprawling again. Lyra's breath hitched as she turned back to the panel, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't afford to waste another second. The core's energy was flickering, the light dimming with each passing moment. If she didn't activate it soon, they'd lose their only chance to escape, and Draven would leave them to die in the wasteland. Her fingers danced over the controls, her mind racing as she pieced together the sequence. Kael groaned, pushing himself up once more. His body felt like it was on fire, but he couldn't give up, not now, not when so much was at stake. He lunged at Draven, catching him off guard with a tackle that sent them both crashing to the floor. The two men grappled, their movements fueled by raw adrenaline and desperation. Kael managed to land a punch, his fist connecting with Draven's jaw, but the satisfaction was short-lived. Draven retaliated with a brutal elbow to Kael's temple, leaving him dazed and disoriented. Lyra's hands froze as a sudden realization hit her. The final piece of the sequence, it wasn't just about the symbols. It required a biometric key, something only she could provide. She pressed her palm against the panel, her breath catching as the core began to hum louder, the light growing brighter. Draven's head snapped toward her, his eyes narrowing. "What are you doing?" he growled, shoving Kael aside and striding toward Lyra. Kael staggered to his feet, his vision still blurry but his determination unshaken. He couldn't let Draven reach her, not when they were so close. Summoning the last of his strength, he charged at Draven, tackling him just as he reached the platform. The two men tumbled to the ground, their struggle a chaotic blur of fists and fury. Lyra's heart raced as the core's energy surged, the chamber filling with a blinding light. She turned to Kael, her voice trembling but resolute. "It's working, just hold him off a little longer." Kael gritted his teeth, his body screaming in protest as he fought to keep Draven at bay. Every second felt like an eternity, but he knew they couldn't afford to fail, not when the fate of the wasteland and everyone in it hung in the balance. The core's hum reached a deafening crescendo, the light enveloping the chamber in a radiant glow. Lyra's hands trembled as she activated the final sequence, her breath catching in her throat. Almost there, she whispered, her eyes locked on the panel. Kael's strength was fading, his body battered and broken, but he refused to let go. He clung to Draven with every ounce of willpower he had left, his grip tightening as the core's energy surged around them. And then, with a final blinding flash, the core activated. The chamber was bathed in light, the hum of energy resonating through the air like a symphony of hope. But as the light faded, Kael's grip loosened, his body collapsing to the ground. Lyra's scream echoed through the chamber. Kael, Draven, stood, his expression unreadable as he looked down at Kael's still form. "Fool," he muttered, turning to Lyra with a cold, calculating gaze. "You've only delayed the inevitable." Lyra's hands clenched into fists, her fear giving way to defiance. "You won't win," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Not while we're still breathing." The core's energy pulsed around them, a reminder of the stakes and the fight that was far from over. With a final, desperate surge of energy, Kael swung his blade in a wide arc, the clash of steel reverberating through the crumbling vault. Draven staggered backward, his dark armor dented and scorched before collapsing to the ground with a hollow thud. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning circuits and molten metal, the remnants of their battle scattered across the shattered chamber. Kael stood panting, his body trembling from exhaustion, but there was no time to rest. The walls around them groaned ominously, cracks spiderwebbing across the reinforced steel as the vault began to collapse. "Kael," Lyra's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and urgent. She was already at the vault's entrance, clutching the pulsating energy core in her hands, its eerie blue light casting flickering shadows on her face. "We have to go now." Kael didn't need to be told twice. He sprinted toward her, his boots crunching over broken glass and twisted metal. Behind him, the ceiling began to cave in, massive chunks of debris crashing to the ground in a deafening roar. The facility was coming apart at the seams, the structural integrity compromised by the battle and the unstable energy core they had fought so hard to secure. As they burst out of the vault, the corridor ahead was a maze of flickering lights and billowing smoke. Alarms blared in a chaotic symphony, red emergency lights casting an ominous glow over the scene. The ground beneath their feet trembled violently, and the air was filled with the sound of distant explosions, each one closer than the last. Lyra led the way, her movements quick and decisive despite the weight of the energy core. Kael followed close behind, his senses on high alert. Every step felt like a gamble, the floor threatening to give way beneath them at any moment. They rounded a corner just as a massive explosion tore through the wall behind them, the force of the blast sending them sprawling to the ground. Kael shielded Lyra instinctively, shrapnel embedding itself in the wall where they had just been standing. "Keep moving," Lyra shouted, her voice barely audible over the din. She scrambled to her feet, her grip on the energy core tightening. Kael nodded, pushing himself up and ignoring the searing pain in his side. There was no time to assess injuries, survival was the only priority. The facility was a labyrinth of destruction, every corridor a new obstacle. Collapsed beams blocked their path, forcing them to climb over jagged rubble. Flames licked at the walls, the heat intense and suffocating. At one point, they were forced to crawl through a narrow gap, the energy core's light illuminating the cramped space as they inched forward. The air grew thinner with each passing moment, the smoke making it hard to breathe. Finally, they reached a service elevator, its doors hanging precariously open. Kael slammed the control panel, but it sparked and fizzed, unresponsive. "It's dead," he muttered, frustration bubbling beneath his exhaustion. Lyra glanced around, her eyes landing on a maintenance ladder leading upward. "There, it's our only way out." Climbing the ladder was no easy feat, especially with the energy core in tow. The rungs were slick with condensation, and the ladder swayed dangerously with every movement. Below them, the facility continued to collapse, the sound of rending metal and roaring flames growing louder. Kael's arms burned with the effort, but he forced himself to keep going, one rung at a time. When they finally reached the surface, the sight that greeted them was both a relief and a grim reminder of what they had endured. The night sky stretched above them, stars twinkling faintly through the haze of smoke. But the ground beneath their feet was unstable, the earth trembling as the facility's collapse sent shockwaves rippling outward. "Run," Lyra urged, and together they sprinted across the barren landscape, the energy core's light cutting through the darkness. Behind them, the ground gave way in a deafening roar, the facility sinking into the earth as flames erupted into the sky. The force of the explosion sent them tumbling forward, the shockwave rolling over them like a tidal wave. When the dust settled, Kael and Lyra lay on their backs, gasping for air. The energy core rested between them, its glow dimming as if exhausted by the ordeal. They had survived barely, but the cost of their victory was etched into their faces, a mixture of relief and dread. The energy core was safe, but the world above was still a wasteland, and their journey was far from over. Kael and Lyra stumbled out of the crumbling vault just as the entrance caved in behind them, dust and debris billowing into the air like a choking fog. The ground shook beneath their feet, a final reminder of how close they'd come to being buried alive. For a moment, they stood there, catching their breath, the weight of their escape sinking in. But that moment of relief was fleeting. From the ridge above, the sound of engines roared to life, deep, guttural growls that echoed across the barren landscape. Kael's eyes narrowed as he scanned the horizon, his hand instinctively tightening around the core they'd risked everything to retrieve. The Scavengers' main force was closing in, their vehicles kicking up clouds of dust as they sped toward the vault's ruins. Lyra's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and urgent. "We need to get this core to the colony now." Her tone left no room for argument. Every second they wasted was another second the Scavengers gained, and if they caught them, everything they'd fought for would be lost. Kael nodded, his mind racing. The colony was miles away, and the terrain between here and there was unforgiving, a wasteland of cracked earth, jagged rock formations, and the occasional rusted relic of the old world. But they had no choice. They couldn't fight an entire scavenger army, not out here in the open. Their only hope was to outrun them. Lyra was already moving, her steps quick and deliberate as she led the way toward a narrow ravine that cut through the landscape like a scar. It wasn't ideal, but it offered cover, at least for a while. Kael followed close behind, his senses on high alert. The core in his hands pulsed faintly, a steady rhythm that felt almost alive. It was strange, holding something so powerful, so essential to the colony's survival, and yet so fragile. One wrong move, and it could be lost, or worse, fall into the wrong hands. As they descended into the ravine, the sound of the Scavengers' engines grew louder, more insistent. Kael glanced over his shoulder, catching a glimpse of their vehicles cresting the ridge. They were close, too close. He quickened his pace, his boots crunching against the loose gravel underfoot. Lyra was several steps ahead, her focus unwavering. She moved like someone who'd spent her entire life navigating danger, her every step calculated, her every breath measured. "If we can make it to the old refinery," she called back, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of authority, "we might be able to lose them in the ruins." Kael nodded again, though she couldn't see him. The refinery was a gamble, a sprawling maze of rusted metal and collapsed structures that had claimed more than a few lives over the years. But it was their best shot. Out here in the open, they were sitting targets. The ravine narrowed further, the walls pressing in on either side until they were forced to move single file. Kael could feel the tension in the air, heavy and suffocating, like the calm before a storm. The core's pulse quickened in his hands as if it, too, sensed the danger closing in. And then the first shot rang out. It ricocheted off the ravine wall just inches from Kael's head, sending a spray of rock fragments into the air. He ducked instinctively, his heart pounding in his chest. The scavengers had found them. Lyra didn't flinch. "Keep moving," she hissed, her voice steady despite the chaos. "We're almost clear." Kael didn't need to be told twice. He pushed forward, his legs burning with the effort, his grip on the core tightening until his knuckles turned white. Behind them, the sound of gunfire echoed through the ravine, a relentless barrage that seemed to come from all directions. But they couldn't stop, not now, not when they were so close. The ravine opened up ahead, spilling them out into a wide, desolate plain. The refinery loomed in the distance, its skeletal frame silhouetted against the pale, washed-out sky. It was a place of death and decay, a monument to the world that had been lost. But for Kael and Lyra, it was their only chance. As they broke into a sprint, the scavengers' vehicles roared into view, their engines screaming like angry beasts. Kael could feel the weight of their pursuit bearing down on him, a pressure that threatened to crush him. But he kept running, his eyes fixed on the refinery, on the faint glimmer of hope it represented. They were running out of time, and if they didn't make it, the core and everything it meant would be gone forever. The stolen scavenger vehicle roared across the cracked, sun-baked terrain, its engine whining under the strain of Kael and Lyra's desperate flight. The air inside was thick with tension, the faint hum of the hovercraft's propulsion system barely audible over the pounding of their hearts. Kael gripped the controls with white-knuckled intensity, his eyes darting between the cracked windshield and the rear-view display. Behind them, a pair of scavenger hovercrafts sliced through the air with predatory precision, their jagged, rust-covered frames glinting in the harsh sunlight. The chase was on, and every second counted. Lyra leaned forward in her seat, her fingers dancing across the vehicle's navigation panel. "We're close," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "The colony's landing site is just beyond the next ridge. If we can make it over that rise, we might lose them in the terrain." Her words were a lifeline, a reminder that they still had a chance. But the odds were slim. The scavengers were relentless, their technology crude but effective, and they knew the wastelands better than anyone. Kael nodded, his jaw tight. He didn't need to say what they were both thinking. This was their only shot. The stolen vehicle was faster than anything they'd ever piloted, but it wasn't built for endurance. The engine was already overheating, and the fuel gauge was inching dangerously close to empty. They couldn't afford a single mistake. As the vehicle skidded around a jagged outcropping of rock, Kael glanced at Lyra. Her focus was absolute, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the colony. She was their best hope, her knowledge of the wastelands unparalleled, her instincts honed by years of survival. The hovercrafts behind them closed the gap, their engines screaming like angry hornets. A burst of energy fire streaked past the stolen vehicle, narrowly missing the tail end. Kael swore under his breath, yanking the controls to the left as another shot lit up the air. "They're not messing around," he muttered, his voice tense. "We need to lose them fast." Lyra's fingers flew across the console, rerouting power to the thrusters. "I'm giving us everything this thing's got," she said, her tone clipped. "But we're not going to outrun them in a straight line. We need to use the terrain." She pointed ahead to the ridge, its jagged silhouette rising against the pale sky. "If we can make it over that, there's a network of canyons on the other side. We might be able to lose them in there." Kael's hands tightened on the controls. The ridge was steep, the ground uneven and littered with debris. It was a risky move, but they didn't have a choice. "Hold on," he warned, slamming the accelerator forward. The vehicle surged ahead, its nose lifting slightly as it raced up the incline. The engine groaned in protest, but they didn't slow down. Behind them, the scavenger hovercrafts hesitated for a split second, just long enough for Kael and Lyra to gain some ground. As they crested the ridge, the landscape unfolded before them in a chaotic sprawl of jagged canyons and deep ravines. The terrain was treacherous, but it was their only chance. Kael guided the stolen vehicle into the nearest canyon, its walls rising steeply on either side. The narrow passage forced the pursuing hovercrafts to slow down, their pilots struggling to navigate the tight turns. For the first time since the chase began, Kael allowed himself a flicker of hope, but the Scavengers weren't giving up. One of the hovercrafts angled sharply, firing another burst of energy that ricocheted off the canyon wall. The shot grazed the stolen vehicle, sending a shower of sparks cascading over the canopy. Lyra cursed, her hands flying over the controls as she tried to stabilize their trajectory. "We can't take another hit like that," she warned, her voice tight. "We're losing power." Kael's mind raced. They were running out of time, out of options. The colony's landing site was close, but the Scavengers were closer. He glanced at Lyra, her face set in determination. They'd come too far to fail now. With a sharp twist of the controls, he sent the vehicle into a steep dive, plunging deeper into the canyon. The maneuver was reckless, but it bought them a few precious seconds. The hovercrafts behind them faltered, their pilots caught off guard by the sudden drop. For a moment, it seemed like they might actually make it, but then the canyon narrowed further, the walls closing in until there was barely enough room for the stolen vehicle to pass. Kael's hands moved instinctively, guiding them through the treacherous passage with a precision born of desperation. Behind them, the Scavenger hovercraft struggled to keep up, their bulkier frames scraping against the canyon walls. And then, just as they emerged from the narrowest part of the canyon, the colony's landing site came into view. It was a sprawling complex of domed structures and landing pads, its lights glowing like a beacon in the fading light. Kael exhaled sharply, his grip on the controls tightening. "Almost there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but the Scavengers weren't done yet. One of the hovercrafts broke free from the canyon, its pilot unleashing a hail of energy fire that streaked toward the stolen vehicle. Kael reacted instantly, swerving to avoid the shots. The maneuver sent them skidding dangerously close to the edge of the canyon, the vehicle's thrusters sputtering as they struggled to maintain altitude. Lyra's voice cut through the chaos. "We're not going to make it like this," she said, her tone urgent. "We need to do something drastic." Her eyes met Kael's, and in that moment they both knew what had to be done. It was a gamble, but it was their only shot. With a nod, Kael angled the vehicle toward a narrow gap in the canyon wall, the opening barely wide enough for them to pass. The hovercrafts behind them hesitated, their pilots unsure of whether to follow. And then, with a final burst of speed, Kael and Lyra shot through the gap, leaving their pursuers behind. The colony's landing site loomed ahead, its lights growing brighter with every passing second. They weren't safe yet, but for the first time since they'd stolen the vehicle, Kael allowed himself to believe they might actually survive this. The Wastelands had tested them in ways they could never have imagined, but they weren't giving up, not now, not ever. The air was thick with tension as Kael and Lyra sprinted across the cracked, irradiated terrain, their breaths ragged and hearts pounding. The distant hum of the Scavenger hovercrafts grew louder, a relentless reminder of the danger closing in. Kael's legs burned with every step, but he pushed forward, his focus locked on the horizon where the colony's landing site shimmered faintly in the heat haze. The core strapped to Lyra's back was more than just a piece of technology. It was hope, the key to survival for everyone back at the colony. Then it happened. A sharp crack echoed across the wasteland, and Kael stumbled, his hand instinctively clutching his side. Blood seeped through his fingers, staining the tattered fabric of his jacket. A scavenger sniper perched on a jagged outcrop had found his mark. Lyra skidded to a halt, her eyes wide with panic as she turned back toward him. "Kael." She shouted, her voice trembling, but Kael didn't falter. His jaw clenched as he forced himself upright, his face pale but determined. "Don't stop for me," he growled through gritted teeth, his voice steady despite the pain. "Get that core to the colony, that's what matters." Lyra hesitated, torn between her instinct to help him and the weight of their mission. The Scavengers were relentless, their hovercrafts closing the gap with every passing second. Kael knew they didn't have time to waste. "Go," he barked, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I'll catch up, just keep moving." Reluctantly, Lyra nodded, her expression a mix of fear and resolve. She adjusted the core on her back and took off, her boots pounding against the cracked earth. Kael watched her for a moment, his vision blurring slightly as the pain radiated through his body. He pressed his hand harder against the wound, willing himself to stay conscious. The colony's survival depended on Lyra making it to the landing site, and he wasn't about to let his injury jeopardize that. The sniper's rifle cracked again, and Kael ducked instinctively, his movement slower now. He scanned the terrain, spotting a cluster of boulders just ahead. If he could make it there, he might have a chance to regroup, or at least buy Lyra more time. Gritting his teeth, he broke into a limping run, each step sending a fresh wave of agony through his side. As he reached the cover of the boulders, Kael leaned heavily against the rock, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He pulled a makeshift medkit from his belt, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the contents. A single stim shot was all he had left, and he jammed it into his thigh without hesitation. The rush of adrenaline was immediate, sharpening his senses and dulling the pain just enough to keep him moving. In the distance, he could see Lyra nearing the landing site, her figure a small but determined silhouette against the barren landscape. The core glinted faintly in the sunlight, a beacon of hope for the colony. Kael allowed himself a faint smile, knowing she was close, but the Scavengers were relentless and their hovercrafts were now within striking distance. Kael knew he couldn't let them reach Lyra. With a grimace, he pushed himself away from the boulder and raised his rifle, his vision steadied by sheer willpower. He fired a few well-aimed shots, forcing the Scavengers to veer off course. It wasn't much, but it might buy Lyra the precious seconds she needed. As the hovercraft circled back, Kael braced himself, his grip tightening on his weapon. He was wounded, outnumbered, and running out of time, but he wasn't done yet. For the colony, for Lyra, he would fight until his last breath. The wasteland had taken so much from them already, but it wouldn't take this, not if he could help it. The sound of engines grew louder, and Kael took a deep breath, steadying his aim. The fight wasn't over, and neither was he. The tension was palpable as Kael and Lyra sprinted toward the landing site, the distant hum of the colony shuttle's engines growing louder with each step. The air was thick with the acrid scent of smoke and the metallic tang of spilled fuel, a grim reminder of the chaos that had unfolded in their wake. Behind them, the ragged cries of the Scavengers echoed through the ruins, their footsteps pounding like a relentless drumbeat. Time was slipping away, and every second felt like an eternity stretched thin. As they reached the edge of the landing zone, the shuttle came into view, a sleek, silver craft gleaming under the pale light of the wasteland sun. Its engines roared to life, sending tremors through the ground as it prepared for departure. Lyra clutched the core tightly to her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The weight of their mission, of everything they'd sacrificed, hung heavy in the air. This was their only chance, the moment that would determine whether their struggle had been worth it. But just as the shuttle's ramp began to lower, a deafening explosion rocked the ground. Kael's head snapped toward the source, his heart sinking as he saw the Scavengers pouring into the clearing, their weapons raised and eyes gleaming with malice. They were relentless, a force of nature that refused to be stopped. Kael's mind raced, calculating the odds. There was no way they could both make it to the shuttle in time. Someone had to stay behind. Without hesitation, Kael turned to Lyra, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Go," take the core and get on that shuttle. I'll hold them off." His words were firm, leaving no room for argument. Lyra's eyes widened, a mix of fear and defiance flashing across her face. She opened her mouth to protest, but Kael cut her off. "This isn't up for debate. You're the only one who can get the core to the colony. If we both stay, we lose everything. Go, now." Lyra hesitated for a moment, torn between loyalty and the grim reality of their situation. But she knew Kael was right. Swallowing her fear, she nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Don't you dare die out here." With that, she turned and sprinted toward the shuttle, her legs burning with every step. Kael watched her go, a flicker of pride cutting through the dread. She was strong, stronger than she even realized, and if anyone could make it, it was her. As Lyra disappeared into the shuttle, Kael turned to face the oncoming horde. His hands tightened around his weapon, the weight of it familiar and grounding. The Scavengers were closing in fast, their numbers overwhelming, but Kael didn't flinch. He'd faced impossible odds before, and he wasn't about to back down now. This was his fight, his burden to bear. If he could buy Lyra even a few extra seconds, it would be worth it. The first wave of Scavengers reached him, their weapons flashing in the dim light. Kael moved with precision, his movements fluid and deliberate. Every shot, every swing of his blade was calculated. He fought not just for survival, but for something greater, for the hope that Lyra carried with her. The thought of her reaching the colony, of the core being used to rebuild what had been lost, fueled his resolve. He wasn't just holding them off, he was buying time for a future worth fighting for. The sounds of battle faded into the background as Kael's focus narrowed to the task at hand. The shuttle's engines roared louder, the vibrations intensifying as it prepared to lift off. He didn't dare look back, didn't dare let himself wonder if Lyra had made it. He couldn't afford the distraction. All he could do was fight, and fight he did, until the ground trembled beneath his feet and the shuttle rose into the sky, leaving him behind in the heart of the storm. The sound of gunfire echoed through the ruined streets, sharp and relentless, as Kael moved like a shadow through the chaos. His every step was calculated, his every strike precise. The Scavengers, a ragtag group of desperate survivors turned predators, swarmed him like a pack of wolves. But Kael wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for Lyra, for the hope she carried, for the fragile promise of a future they'd barely begun to imagine. He ducked behind a crumbling wall, his breath ragged but steady as bullets ricocheted off the concrete. Peering out, he counted 5 of them, maybe 6, their faces twisted with malice and hunger. They weren't just after supplies, they wanted blood. Kael tightened his grip on the battered rifle slung across his chest, its weight a familiar comfort. He knew he was outnumbered, outgunned, but he also knew he couldn't afford to fail. Not now, not when Lyra's life depended on him. With a burst of adrenaline, he broke cover, firing in controlled bursts. One Scavenger went down, then another. His movements were fluid, almost instinctive, born of years spent scraping by in this unforgiving wasteland. But for every enemy he took down, 2 more seemed to emerge from the shadows. They were relentless, driven by the same desperation that had once fueled him. Kael's arms burned with exhaustion, his vision blurring as sweat dripped into his eyes. He could feel the weight of every moment, every decision pressing down on him. He pushed forward, driven by sheer willpower, his body moving on autopilot. Another Scavenger fell, and then another, but as he turned to face the next wave, a searing pain exploded in his side. He stumbled, his hand instinctively going to the wound. Blood seeped through his fingers, warm and sticky. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay upright. The shuttle was close now, so close he could almost hear the hum of its engines. Lyra was there, waiting for him, her face a beacon of hope in the midst of the chaos. He couldn't let her down, not after everything they'd been through. But the scavengers were closing in, their numbers overwhelming. Kael's strength was fading fast, his movements growing sluggish. He fired again, and another enemy fell, but it wasn't enough. A blow to the back of his head sent him crashing to his knees, the world spinning around him. He tried to rise to fight back, but his body betrayed him. As he collapsed onto the cracked pavement, his vision blurring, he caught a glimpse of the shuttle lifting off. Lyra's voice cut through the noise, raw and anguished, screaming his name. Tears streamed down her face as she reached out, her fingers brushing against the air as if she could pull him back, save him from the fate closing in around him. Kael's last thought was of her, of the life they might have had, the dreams they dared to share. And then, darkness, the shuttle rose higher, leaving the chaos and carnage behind. Lyra's sobs echoed through the cockpit, a heartbreaking counterpoint to the hum of the engines. She clutched the controls, her knuckles white, her heart shattered. Kael had given everything to get her here to this moment, and now, as the wasteland stretched out below her, she knew she had to carry on, not just for herself, but for him. For the hope he'd fought so hard to protect. The shuttle disappeared into the horizon, leaving behind the echoes of a battle fought and lost, and the memory of a man who had given everything for a chance at something better. The shuttle shuddered as it broke through the thick atmosphere, its thrusters roaring against the gravitational pull of the dying Earth. Lyra gripped the controls tightly, her knuckles white, her mind a storm of emotions. Behind her, the energy core pulsed faintly, its soft blue glow a beacon of hope. It was more than just a device, it was the lifeline for the colony, the key to humanity's survival. As the shuttle descended toward the sprawling metal and glass structures of the colony, Lyra couldn't shake the weight of what they'd left behind. The wasteland, the chaos, and Kael. The landing was rough, the shuttle skidding slightly on the colony's landing pad. Lyra barely noticed. Her hands moved on autopilot, powering down the systems and initiating the docking sequence. The hatch hissed open and a wave of sterile, recycled air hit her. Outside, a crowd had gathered, engineers, scientists, and colonists, their faces a mix of hope and desperation. They'd been waiting for this moment, for the energy core that would restore power to their failing systems. But as Lyra stepped out, carrying the core in her arms like a fragile relic, her thoughts were far from the cheers and applause that erupted around her. She handed the core to the colony's chief engineer, a wiry man with a face etched by years of stress. "It's intact," she said, her voice hollow. "It'll work." The engineer nodded, his eyes gleaming with a mix of relief and urgency, and hurried off to integrate the core into the colony's power grid. Lyra watched him go, her chest tightening. The core was safe, the colony would survive, but at what cost? As the hum of renewed energy began to ripple through the colony, lighting up darkened corridors and powering dormant machines, Lyra found herself retreating to a quiet corner. The celebration around her felt distant, almost surreal. She leaned against a cold metal wall, her gaze unfocused, her mind replaying the last moments in the wasteland. Kael's face flashed before her, his determined expression, the way he'd pushed her toward the shuttle, his voice steady even as the ground shook around them. "Go," he'd said, "finish this," and then he was gone, swallowed by the chaos. She closed her eyes, muttering under her breath, "He gave everything for us." The words felt heavy, weighted with guilt and gratitude. Kael had always been the one who believed in the mission, who saw the bigger picture even when the rest of them faltered. He'd known the risks, accepted them without hesitation, and now, because of him, they had a chance to rebuild, to start over. But for Lyra, the victory felt hollow. She couldn't shake the image of him standing there, alone, as the world collapsed around him. The colony buzzed with activity around her, people rushing to take advantage of the restored power. Systems came online, communication arrays activated, and for the first time in years the colony felt alive. But Lyra remained still, her thoughts spiraling. She thought about the people they'd lost, the sacrifices that had brought them here. Kael's sacrifice. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. He'd given everything, and now it was up to her, to all of them, to honor that, to make sure it wasn't in vain. As the colony's lights flickered to life, casting long shadows across the walls, Lyra straightened. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. There was work to do, a future to build. But in the quiet moments when the noise faded and the lights dimmed, she knew Kael's absence would linger, a reminder of the cost of survival and the weight of hope. Kael groaned as consciousness slowly returned, his body racked with pain. The world around him was a blur of muted colors and shifting shadows, the acrid scent of burnt earth filling his nostrils. He tried to move, but a sharp, searing pain shot through his side, forcing him to lie still. His memories were fractured flashes of the explosion, the crumbling ruins, and the desperate scramble to escape. But here, now, he was alive, that much was clear. A voice broke through the haze, low and steady. "You're not done yet, survivor." Kael turned his head, his vision gradually sharpening to reveal the face of a woman crouched beside him. She was wrapped in layers of patched cloth, her skin weathered by the harshness of the wasteland. Her eyes, though tired, held a spark of determination. It was the same woman who had helped him before, one of the nomadic survivors who had pulled him from the wreckage of his last battle. Behind her, a small group moved quietly, tending to a makeshift campfire and checking supplies. They were a ragtag group, but their movements were efficient, practiced. These were people who had learned to survive in a world that offered no mercy. "You've got a knack for finding trouble," the woman said, her tone dry but not unkind. She handed him a canteen, the water warm but welcome. Kael drank greedily, his throat raw from dust and smoke. Where are we?" he managed to ask, his voice hoarse. "Far enough from the blast zone to be safe, but not far enough to be comfortable," she replied. "You're lucky we found you when we did. Another hour, and you'd have been scavenger bait." Kael winced as he tried to sit up, but the woman placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Easy, you took a beating out there. Broken ribs, probably a concussion. You're not going anywhere for a while." He wanted to argue, to tell her he didn't have time to rest, but the pain in his body silenced him. Instead, he looked around, taking in the desolate landscape. The wasteland stretched endlessly in every direction, a barren expanse of cracked earth and jagged rock. The sky was a dull, ashen gray, the sun obscured by clouds of dust and smoke. It was a harsh, unforgiving world, but it was the only one they had. The woman noticed his gaze and followed it, her expression hardening. "This place, it doesn't care if you live or die," she said quietly. "But we do. That's why we stick together. That's why we came back for you." Kael nodded, a flicker of gratitude cutting through the pain. He had been on his own for so long, relying only on his wits and his will to survive. But now, here among these strangers, he felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of connection, however fragile. "You're not done yet," the woman repeated, her voice firm. "Not by a long shot. The wasteland has a way of testing us, of pushing us to our limits, but it's not just about surviving. It's about what we do with the time we've got, and right now you've got a choice to make." Kael looked at her, his brow furrowed. What choice? She leaned closer, her eyes locking onto his. "You can keep running, keep fighting just to stay alive, or you can fight for something bigger, something worth dying for." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Kael felt the weight of them settle over him, pressing against the pain and the fatigue. He had spent so long just trying to survive, to outlast the dangers of this broken world. But now, faced with the possibility of something more, he felt a spark of hope, tiny but undeniable. The woman stood, brushing the dust from her hands. "Rest for now. We'll talk more when you're stronger, but remember, Survivor the Wasteland isn't done with you yet, and neither are we." As she walked away, Kael leaned back, his mind racing despite his exhaustion. The choices ahead were as vast and uncertain as the wasteland itself, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't alone, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough to keep him going. Kael's body ached, but the pain was nothing compared to the weight of his thoughts. The nomads had saved him, patching up his wounds with a mix of ancient medical knowledge and whatever scraps they could scavenge. Their camp was a makeshift haven, tucked away in the shadows of crumbling skyscrapers, where the faint hum of generators and the glow of solar lamps hinted at a life that refused to be extinguished. As he regained his strength, Kael began to observe the people who had taken him in. They moved with purpose, their faces etched with the kind of determination that only comes from years of struggle. It didn't take long for him to learn their story. The nomads had been fighting the Scavengers for as long as anyone could remember. These marauders, once ordinary people, had devolved into something far darker, a relentless force that preyed on the weak, stripping the wasteland of its last resources. The nomads weren't just surviving, they were resisting. They had carved out pockets of safety, defended their people, and even managed to grow food in the poisoned soil. But their fight was far from over. Kael listened intently as one of the elders, a woman named Mara, recounted the battles they'd fought and the losses they'd endured. Her voice was steady, but there was a flicker of something deeper, rage, sorrow, or maybe hope. "They take everything," she said, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "But we've learned to take it back, every piece of land, every drop of water, every scrap of dignity. It's not just about surviving anymore, it's about reclaiming what's ours." Her words struck a chord deep within him. Kael had been running for so long, focused solely on his own survival. But now, surrounded by these people who refused to give up, he felt something shift. It wasn't just gratitude, it was a sense of purpose. These nomads weren't just fighting for themselves, they were fighting for the future of humanity. And Kael realized he couldn't stand by and watch. If humanity's going to survive, he said one evening, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the camp, "We need to take back this world." The words felt heavy but also right. They were a vow not just to the nomads but to himself. He wasn't just a survivor anymore, he was part of something bigger. The nomads welcomed him into their ranks, teaching him their ways. He learned how to navigate the wasteland's treacherous terrain, how to spot scavenger traps, and how to fight with the kind of precision that only comes from desperation. But more than that, he learned about their vision for the future. They weren't just trying to rebuild, they were trying to create something better. They had plans for clean water systems, sustainable energy, and even schools to teach the next generation. It was a vision of hope, and Kael found himself drawn to it. As the days turned into weeks, Kael began to see the wasteland in a new light. It wasn't just a barren expanse of death and decay. It was a battlefield, and the stakes were higher than he'd ever imagined. The Scavengers weren't just a threat, they were a symbol of everything humanity had lost. And if the nomads could stand against them, then maybe there was a chance, however slim, for something more. Kael's decision to join their cause wasn't made lightly. He knew the risks, the sacrifices, and the odds stacked against them. But he also knew that staying on the sidelines wasn't an option. The world had taken so much from him, his family, his home, his sense of safety. But now, for the first time in years, he felt like he had something worth fighting for. As he stood at the edge of the camp, looking out over the wasteland, Kael felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It was fragile, but it was there. And with the nomads by his side, he was ready to fan that spark into a flame. The fight ahead would be brutal, but Kael was done running. It was time to take back the world. The wastelands were no longer a silent graveyard of forgotten hopes. Kael, with his ragtag band of nomads, had ignited a spark that refused to be extinguished. Each night, under the cover of darkness, they struck with precision, their movements as fluid and unpredictable as the shifting sands. The Scavengers, once the undisputed tyrants of the wasteland, now found themselves on the defensive. Their once impenetrable strongholds were reduced to smoldering ruins, their supply lines severed, and their morale crumbling like the rusted metal of their war machines. Kael's name began to echo across the barren plains, whispered by survivors who had long since given up on the idea of resistance. The first attack came at the Scavengers' largest outpost, a fortress of jagged metal and barbed wire nestled deep in the heart of the wasteland. Kael and his nomads moved like shadows, their approach silent and deliberate. They struck not with brute force but with cunning, sabotaging the outpost's water supply and setting fire to their fuel reserves. The Scavengers, caught off guard, scrambled to contain the chaos, but it was too late. By dawn, the outpost was a smoking ruin, its once feared defenders fleeing into the desert. Word of the victory spread quickly, carried by the wind and the whispers of those who had witnessed it. For the first time in years, the survivors of the wasteland dared to hope. But Kael knew that one victory, no matter how significant, would not be enough. The Scavengers were a hydra, cut off one head, and two more would take its place. His strategy had to be relentless, a series of calculated strikes that would erode their strength and fracture their unity. His nomads, though few in number, were fiercely loyal and battle-hardened. They moved like ghosts, striking with speed and vanishing before the Scavengers could mount a counterattack. Each raid was a lesson in guerrilla warfare, a masterclass in exploiting the enemy's weaknesses. They targeted supply convoys, ambushed patrols, and sabotaged communication lines, leaving the Scavengers disoriented and demoralized. One particularly daring raid took place at a Scavenger-controlled water refinery, a lifeline for their forces in the region. Kael and his team infiltrated the facility under the guise of a sandstorm, their faces masked and their movements indistinguishable from the swirling dust. Using stolen Scavenger uniforms, they blended in seamlessly, planting explosives at key points throughout the refinery. When the charges detonated, the resulting explosion lit up the night sky, a beacon of defiance visible for miles. The refinery's destruction was a crippling blow to the Scavengers, cutting off their access to clean water and forcing them to ration what little they had left. For the survivors watching from the shadows, it was a sign that the balance of power was shifting. Kael's legend grew with each victory, his name becoming a rallying cry for those who had once lived in fear. Survivors who had hidden in the ruins of the old world now emerged, emboldened by his example. They formed their own resistance groups, adopting Kael's tactics and spreading his message of hope. The wasteland, once a place of despair, was transforming into a battleground of defiance. Each small victory, each act of resistance chipped away at the Scavengers' dominance. Kael's leadership was not just about strategy, it was about inspiring others to believe in the possibility of a better future. Yet, even as his legend grew, Kael remained grounded. He knew that the fight was far from over and that the Scavengers would not go down without a fight. Their retaliation would be swift and brutal, and the nomads would need to stay one step ahead. But for now, the momentum was on their side. The wasteland was no longer a place of silent suffering. It was a place of rising hope, and Kael was at the heart of it all. His name, once just a whisper, was now a roar, echoing across the desolate landscape and igniting the flames of rebellion. Lyra stood at the observation deck of the orbital colony, her gaze fixed on the distant blue-green orb of Earth. It had been years since she last set foot on its surface, years since she and Kael had fought side by side to survive the chaos of the wasteland. But now, the reports streaming in from below were impossible to ignore. Kael, the man who had once been her partner in survival, was making waves, stirring up the remnants of the old world, rallying survivors, and challenging the oppressive factions that still clung to power. His exploits were bold, almost reckless, and Lyra couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and unease. Pride because Kael was proving that one person could make a difference. Unease because she knew the risks he was taking. She turned away from the window, her mind racing. The colony had become a sanctuary, a place where humanity could rebuild and dream of a better future. But Lyra had never forgotten their original mission, to restore Earth, to reclaim what had been lost. And now, with Kael's actions drawing attention, she knew the time had come to act. Calling her team together, Lyra addressed them with a calm yet resolute tone. "We've built something extraordinary here," she began, gesturing to the bustling corridors of the colony. "But we can't forget where we came from. Earth is still out there, still bleeding, still fighting, and Kael, he's out there too, risking everything to finish what we started." She paused, letting her words sink in. "We owe it to him and to ourselves to see this through. It's time to go back." The room was silent, the weight of her declaration hanging in the air. Her team, a diverse group of engineers, scientists, and former survivors, exchanged glances. They had all come to the colony seeking refuge, but Lyra's vision had always been about more than survival. It was about redemption. One by one, they nodded, their resolve hardening. The mission ahead wouldn't be easy. Earth was a fractured world, scarred by radiation, overrun by rogue factions, and teeming with dangers both old and new. But Lyra had a plan. Drawing on the colony's advanced technology and her own intimate knowledge of the wasteland, she outlined a strategy to infiltrate the surface and locate Kael. "We'll need to move quickly and quietly," she explained, pulling up a holographic map of Earth's surface. Kael's last known location was here, in the ruins of Sector 7. It's a hot zone, crawling with scavengers and warlords, but it's also where we're most likely to find him. She zoomed in on the sector, highlighting key landmarks and potential hazards. "We'll deploy in small teams, using stealth suits and cloaking tech to avoid detection. Our primary objective is to establish contact with Kael and assess the situation on the ground. From there, we'll adapt." As the meeting continued, Lyra's confidence grew. This wasn't just a rescue mission, it was a chance to reignite the spark of hope that had driven them in the early days of the apocalypse. She knew the risks, but she also knew the rewards. If they succeeded, they could change the course of history. But beneath her determination, there was a flicker of doubt. Kael had always been a wild card, driven by instinct and emotion rather than strategy. Would he welcome their intervention or see it as interference? And what if they were too late? She pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. As the team dispersed to prepare for the mission, Lyra returned to the observation deck. Earth loomed large in the viewport, a reminder of all they had lost and all they had yet to regain. She whispered a promise to herself and to Kael wherever he was. "We're coming, and this time we won't stop until it's done." The journey ahead would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine, but Lyra was ready. She had to be, because the fate of Earth and the future of humanity depended on it. As the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, casting long shadows over the desolate wasteland, Kael and the nomads prepared for what could be their final stand. The Scavengers' stronghold loomed in the distance, a fortress of rusted metal and jagged spikes, a monument to the brutality of their rule. Kael stood at the edge of the nomad encampment, his eyes fixed on the fortress, his mind racing through the lessons he'd learned during his perilous journey. He had survived the unforgiving wilderness, outsmarted raiders, and forged alliances with those who shared his vision of a free wasteland. Now it was time to put those lessons to the test. The nomads gathered around him, their faces etched with determination. These were people who had lost everything to the Scavengers' families, homes, hope. But tonight, they weren't just survivors, they were warriors united by a common purpose. Kael addressed them in a low, steady voice, his words carrying the weight of experience. "We've all faced the darkness out here," he began, "but tonight we bring the fight to them. Remember, this isn't about revenge, it's about freedom for us and for everyone they've enslaved." The plan was bold, a blend of strategy and audacity. Kael had spent weeks studying the Scavengers' movements, their routines, their weaknesses. He knew their fortress was heavily guarded, but it had one critical flaw: its reliance on a single power source deep within its core. If they could disable it, the entire operation would collapse. The nomads, skilled in stealth and sabotage, would infiltrate the fortress under the cover of darkness, while Kael led a diversionary attack to draw their forces away. It was risky, but it was their only chance. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, the nomads moved into position. Kael's heart pounded as he approached the fortress's eastern perimeter, a small group of fighters at his side. They carried crude explosives crafted from scavenged materials and a fierce determination to see this through. The diversion began with a series of controlled blasts, lighting up the night and sending the scavengers scrambling. Shouts echoed through the air as guards rushed to investigate, leaving key areas unguarded. Kael's team pressed forward, using the chaos to their advantage. Inside the fortress, the nomads moved like shadows, slipping past distracted guards and disabling security systems. They worked with precision, their movements honed by years of surviving in the wasteland. One by one, they reached their targets, planting explosives at critical points. The tension was palpable, every second stretching into an eternity. One wrong move, one misstep, and the entire plan could unravel. Meanwhile, Kael and his team fought fiercely, holding their ground against the Scavengers' relentless onslaught. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning metal. Kael's mind flashed back to the lessons he'd learned: trust your instincts, adapt to the chaos, and never lose sight of your goal. He fought not just for himself, but for everyone who had suffered under the Scavengers' rule. Finally, the signal came, a low whistle that cut through the din of battle. The nomads had succeeded. Kael gave the order to fall back, and as they retreated, the fortress erupted in a series of deafening explosions. The ground shook and the night sky was illuminated by a fiery blaze. The Scavengers' stronghold was crippled, their operations brought to a standstill. As the dust settled, Kael stood amidst the wreckage, his chest heaving, his body battered but unbroken. The nomads gathered around him, their faces alight with triumph. It wasn't just a victory, it was a declaration. The wasteland was no longer a place of despair. It was a place of hope, of resistance, of a future worth fighting for. And Kael knew this was only the beginning. The shuttle descended through the thick, ashen clouds, its engines humming softly as it cut through the heavy atmosphere. Inside, Lyra gripped the edge of her seat, her heart pounding in her chest. The surface of Earth loomed below, a desolate, ravaged landscape of cracked earth and skeletal remains of cities long abandoned. She had spent months imagining this moment, replaying every possible scenario in her mind. But now that it was here, she felt a strange mix of hope and dread. Would he still be there? Would he even be alive? The thought of finding Kael, or worse, not finding him, was almost too much to bear. As the shuttle touched down on the barren ground, the team moved quickly, their movements sharp and efficient. The airlock hissed open and Lyra stepped out first, her boots crunching on the brittle soil. The air was thick with the scent of decay and ash, but she barely noticed. Her eyes scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of movement. The others followed, their weapons at the ready, but Lyra's focus was singular. She had come this far, she wasn't leaving without answers. Then, in the distance, she saw him, a lone figure silhouetted against the bleak sky, standing atop a crumbling ridge, her breath caught in her throat. Even from this distance, she recognized the way he carried himself, the slight tilt of his head, the broad shoulders that seemed to carry the weight of the world. It was Kael, alive. Her legs moved before her mind could catch up, carrying her across the uneven ground as fast as she could manage. The others called after her, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. When she reached him, Lyra froze for a moment, her eyes tracing every inch of his face. He looked older, his features hardened by the harshness of the wasteland, but it was unmistakably him. His eyes met hers, and for a second, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice choked with emotion, she whispered, "I thought I lost you." The words hung in the air, heavy with all the fear and longing she had carried since their separation. Kael's lips curved into that familiar half-smile, the one that always managed to make her feel like everything would be okay. He stepped closer, his hand reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face. "I told you I wasn't done yet," he said, his voice steady but laced with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. In that moment, the weight of everything they had endured, the battles, the losses, the endless nights wondering if they would ever see each other again, seemed to melt away. They were together, and for now that was enough. The others caught up, their presence a reminder of the world they still had to face, but Lyra barely noticed. Her hand found Kael's, their fingers intertwining as if they had never been apart. Around them, the wasteland stretched endlessly, a barren expanse that had swallowed so much. Yet, in that moment, it felt as though the world had narrowed to just the two of them. They had fought against impossible odds, survived horrors that would have broken lesser people, and here they were, alive together and ready to face whatever came next. Kael's gaze shifted to the team behind her, his expression turning serious. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice low. "There's something you need to see." Lyra nodded, the weight of his words pulling her back to reality. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was still hope for this broken world. Kael and Lyra stood at the edge of the ruined city, the horizon stained with the faint glow of a dying sun. The air was thick with tension, a palpable sense of urgency that seemed to seep into every crack of the broken landscape. Around them, a small group of survivors gathered, their faces etched with determination and exhaustion. These were the people who had endured the worst of the Scavengers' tyranny, families torn apart, homes reduced to ash, and lives shattered by the relentless brutality of the wasteland. But tonight, they were not just survivors. Tonight, they were warriors, united under the leadership of Kael and Lyra, ready to fight for the future they had been denied. Kael, his once solitary demeanor softened by the weight of leadership, stepped forward. His voice carried across the crowd, steady and resolute. "We've lost too much to let them take anything more," he began, his words cutting through the silence. "Every step we've taken, every battle we've fought has led us here. This isn't just about survival anymore. It's about reclaiming what's ours, our land, our freedom, our humanity." Lyra stood beside him, her presence a quiet force of strength. Her eyes scanned the faces before her, each one a story of resilience. She knew that rallying these people wasn't just about strategy or numbers. It was about reigniting the spark of hope that the Scavengers had tried so hard to extinguish. "We've all suffered," she said, her voice firm yet compassionate. "But together we're stronger than they could ever imagine. This fight isn't just for us, it's for everyone who couldn't be here today, for everyone who believed in a better world even when it seemed impossible." The crowd stirred, murmurs of agreement rippling through the group. Among them were faces Kael and Lyra had come to know well, old allies like Jax, whose mechanical expertise had kept their equipment running, and Mira, the fearless scout who had mapped the Scavengers' movements. But there were also newcomers, survivors who had traveled from distant outposts, drawn by whispers of a resistance that refused to back down. Each person brought something vital to the cause: skills, knowledge, and most importantly, the will to fight. As the night deepened, Kael and Lyra began outlining their plan. The Scavengers' stronghold was a fortress, heavily guarded and nearly impenetrable, but they had one advantage: the element of surprise. The Scavengers had grown complacent, their grip on the wasteland so absolute that they hadn't anticipated a unified resistance. Kael's experience as a strategist and Lyra's deep understanding of the terrain gave them an edge. They would strike at dawn, using the chaos of the early morning light to their advantage. The preparations were grueling, weapons were distributed, makeshift armor was reinforced, and supplies were rationed with precision. Every detail mattered, from the placement of snipers to the timing of the diversionary attacks. Kael moved among the group, offering guidance and encouragement. His presence was a constant reminder of what they were fighting for, a world where fear no longer dictated their lives. Lyra, meanwhile, focused on the emotional toll of the upcoming battle. She knew that fear and doubt could be as dangerous as any enemy. She spoke quietly with those who seemed hesitant, sharing stories of her own struggles and the moments that had kept her going. "Fear doesn't make you weak," she told them. "It's what you do with it that matters, and right now we have a chance to turn that fear into something powerful." As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the survivors stood ready. Kael and Lyra stood at the forefront, their bond a silent testament to the strength of their partnership. They had come so far, from strangers thrown together by circumstance to leaders united by a shared vision. The battle ahead would be brutal, but they were prepared to face it together. The signal was given, and the resistance surged forward, a wave of determination crashing against the walls of the Scavengers' stronghold. The air was filled with the sounds of battle cries of defiance, the clash of weapons, and the roar of engines as vehicles tore through the enemy line. Kael fought with precision, his movements calculated and deliberate, while Lyra moved with agility, her sharp instincts guiding her through the chaos. This was more than a fight for survival. It was a fight for redemption, for the chance to rebuild what had been lost. And as the battle raged on, Kael and Lyra knew that no matter the outcome, they had already achieved something extraordinary. They had brought hope back to the wasteland. The battlefield was a chaotic symphony of clashing steel, crackling energy, and desperate shouts. Kael and Lyra stood side by side at the heart of the fray, their movements a seamless dance of precision and power. Kael's tactical mind worked overtime, his voice cutting through the din as he barked orders, directing their allies to exploit the Scavengers' weak points. Lyra, ever the embodiment of raw strength and agility, moved like a storm, her blade a blur as it carved through the enemy ranks. Together, they were unstoppable, a perfect fusion of strategy and ferocity that left the Scavengers scrambling to regroup. The Scavengers, though numerous, were disorganized and reckless, their attacks more brute force than calculated strikes. Kael had anticipated this, and his plan unfolded with near-perfect execution. He had divided their forces into smaller, more agile units, each tasked with isolating and dismantling the enemy's flanks. Lyra, meanwhile, led the charge head-on, her presence alone enough to sow panic among the Scavengers. For a moment, it seemed as though victory was within their grasp, the tide of battle firmly in their favor. But the Scavengers were not without their own cunning. Just as Kael and Lyra's forces began to press their advantage, a low, ominous hum began to resonate across the battlefield. It started as a faint vibration beneath their feet, barely noticeable amidst the chaos, but it quickly grew louder, more insistent. Kael's sharp instincts kicked in, his eyes scanning the horizon for the source of the sound. What he saw made his blood run cold. From the heart of the Scavenger ranks emerged a massive, hulking machine, its surface bristling with jagged edges and glowing conduits. It was unlike anything Kael had ever encountered, a fusion of ancient technology and scavenged parts, pulsing with an eerie, malevolent energy. The machine's central core glowed a sickly green, and as it powered up, the air around it seemed to warp and distort. Kael barely had time to shout a warning before the weapon unleashed its full fury. A blinding beam of energy erupted from the machine, slicing through the battlefield like a scythe. Where it struck, the ground erupted in flames, and anything or anyone caught in its path was vaporized instantly. The shockwave sent Kael and Lyra sprawling, their ears ringing from the deafening blast. Around them, the once organized ranks of their allies were thrown into disarray, their momentum shattered in an instant. Lyra was the first to recover, her jaw clenched in determination as she pushed herself to her feet. "What the hell is that thing?" she growled, her eyes fixed on the machine as it began to recharge for another attack. Kael, still reeling from the blast, forced himself to focus. "Some kind of energy cannon," he muttered, his mind racing. "They must have dug it up from one of the old war vaults. It's ancient tech way beyond anything we've seen before." The Scavengers, emboldened by the devastation wrought by their weapon, began to press their advantage. Their chaotic ranks now moved with a newfound purpose, closing in on Kael and Lyra's scattered forces. The tide of battle had turned, and for the first time, doubt crept into Kael's mind. He had always prided himself on being prepared for any scenario, but this was something else entirely. Lyra, however, refused to back down. "We're not done yet," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "That thing's powerful, but it's slow. If we can get close enough, we might be able to take it out." Kael nodded, his mind already working on a new plan. "We'll need to split up," he said. "You draw their attention, keep them focused on you. I'll find a way to disable that weapon." As the Scavengers closed in, Kael and Lyra shared a brief, unspoken moment of understanding. This was no longer just a battle for survival. It was a test of their resolve, their ability to adapt and overcome even the most impossible odds. The stakes had never been higher, and failure was not an option. With a final nod, they moved into action, each step bringing them closer to the heart of the storm. The fight was far from over, and the true cost of victory was yet to be determined. Kael and Lyra stood in the dim, flickering light of the underground facility, their breaths shallow as they stared at the massive weapon before them. Its surface hummed with an eerie energy, pulsing like a living thing. The air around it crackled, charged with a power that felt almost alive. Lyra's fingers traced the edge of the console, her mind racing as she deciphered the symbols etched into its surface. "It's not just one core," she said, her voice low but steady. "There's a second one hidden deeper within the system. That's what's keeping it operational." Kael's jaw tightened as he processed her words. "A second core," he muttered, his eyes narrowing. "That changes everything. If we take out the primary one, the backup will just kick in. We'd be wasting our time and our lives." He glanced at her, his expression grim but resolute. "We'll have to destroy both simultaneously. But even if we manage to pull it off, the blast radius," he trailed off, not needing to finish the thought. The unspoken truth hung heavy between them. Success would mean their own end. Lyra nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving the weapon. "It's the only way," she said, her voice firm despite the weight of what she was suggesting. "If we don't stop this thing, it'll level everything within miles, entire settlements, innocent people gone. We can't let that happen." She turned to Kael, her eyes searching his. "We've always known the risks. If this is how it ends, at least we go out fighting." Kael's lips curled into a wry smile, the kind that only came from years of shared battles and unspoken trust. "You always did have a way with words," he said, his tone light despite the gravity of the moment. "All right, then, let's make it count." He reached for the pack slung over his shoulder, pulling out a set of tools and a handful of explosive charges. We'll need to plant these at both cores. Timing's everything. If one goes off too soon, the other might not detonate. We'll have to trigger them manually. Lyra took one of the charges, her fingers brushing his as she did. We'll split up, she said. I'll take the primary core, you handle the backup. We'll meet back here once it's done. She paused, her voice softening. If we don't make it, just know I wouldn't have wanted to do this with anyone else. Kael's smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet determination. Same here, he said simply. There was no need for grand speeches or tearful goodbyes. They'd been through too much together for that. Instead, they shared a brief nod, a silent acknowledgement of everything they'd faced and everything they were about to sacrifice. Then, without another word, they turned and moved in opposite directions, each heading toward their respective targets. The facility was a labyrinth of narrow corridors and crumbling infrastructure, the air thick with the scent of rust and decay. Kael moved quickly but cautiously, his senses on high alert. Every step brought him closer to the backup core, and with it, the finality of their mission. He could feel the weight of the explosive in his hand, a tangible reminder of what was at stake. The thought crossed his mind that this might be the last thing he ever did, that these could be his final moments. But he pushed the fear aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. There was no room for doubt, no time for hesitation. Meanwhile, Lyra navigated her way to the primary core, her heart pounding in her chest. The weapon's energy was overwhelming up close, a constant, oppressive force that made it hard to breathe. She set the charge carefully, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. As she worked, she thought of all they'd been through, the battles they'd fought, the lives they'd saved, the moments of quiet hope in a world that often seemed devoid of it. She thought of Kael, of their unspoken bond, and the unyielding trust that had carried them this far. When the charges were set, they returned to the central chamber, their paths converging once more. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, but neither felt the need to voice them. Instead, they stood side by side, their eyes fixed on the weapon that had brought them to this moment. Kael reached for the detonator, his hand steady as he handed it to Lyra. "You should do the honors," he said, his voice quiet but firm. She took it without hesitation, her fingers curling around the device. "On 3, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. 1, 2, her thumb hovered over the button, her heart pounding in her ears. 3, Kael said, his voice blending with hers as she pressed it. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the world erupted in a blinding flash of light and sound, and everything went dark. The air inside the Scavengers' weapon facility was thick with the acrid smell of oil and burnt metal, a sharp contrast to the cold, open wasteland they'd left behind. Kael tightened his grip on the makeshift plasma cutter, its faint hum barely audible over the distant clatter of machinery. Beside him, Lyra adjusted the straps of her scavenged armor, her eyes sharp and focused, scanning the dimly lit corridor ahead. The facility was a labyrinth of rusted steel and flickering neon lights, a fortress of chaos where every corner could hide an enemy. They had come this far together, and now, standing on the edge of what felt like an impossible mission, their resolve burned brighter than ever. "You ready for this?" Kael whispered, his voice steady but low, barely audible over the ambient hum of the facility. Lyra glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Ready as I'll ever be," she replied, her tone light but laced with determination. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a bond forged through countless battles and shared hardships. They didn't need grand speeches or dramatic declarations. A look, a nod, a quiet word, that was enough. The first wave of scavengers came without warning, emerging from the shadows like wraiths. Their weapons gleamed in the harsh light, crude but deadly. Kael moved first, his plasma cutter slicing through the air with precision, while Lyra's agility turned her into a blur of motion, her blade finding its mark with deadly accuracy. The fight was brutal and unrelenting, the sound of clashing metal and guttural cries echoing through the corridors. Yet, despite the chaos, they moved as one, each step and strike perfectly synchronized, as if they could read each other's thoughts. As they pressed deeper into the facility, the odds grew steeper. The Scavengers had numbers, but Kael and Lyra had something far more potent: trust. When Kael's weapon faltered, Lyra was there to cover him, her blade a whirlwind of steel. When Lyra stumbled, Kael's plasma cutter created an opening, giving her the seconds she needed to recover. They didn't need to speak, their actions said everything. Every glance, every movement was a silent affirmation of their partnership. Finally, they reached the core, a massive chamber dominated by a towering machine that pulsed with ominous energy. The air crackled with tension, and the Scavengers guarding it were unlike any they'd faced before, heavily armored, their movements precise and calculated. Kael took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with the weight of the moment. "This is it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lyra nodded, her eyes never leaving the enemy ahead. "We've come too far to turn back now." In the moments before the final charge, they exchanged quiet words, not of fear but of encouragement. "Stay close," Kael said, his voice steady. "Always," Lyra replied, her tone firm but warm. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about proving that even in the face of overwhelming odds, they could stand together and fight for something greater than themselves. The bond between them wasn't just a shield, it was their greatest weapon. As they surged forward, the world seemed to slow, every heartbeat, every breath echoing in their ears. The fight was fierce, the kind of battle that would be etched into their memories forever. But through it all, they never wavered. Together, they were unstoppable. The air was thick with tension as Kael stood at the edge of the Scavengers' facility, his hands gripping the controls of the unstable core. The hum of energy reverberated through the walls, a deafening reminder of the power he was about to unleash. He knew this was the only way. Destroying the core would obliterate the Scavengers' weapon and give their allies a fighting chance, but it came at a cost. A cost he was willing to pay. Lyra's voice cut through the chaos, desperate and raw. "Kael, don't, there has to be another way." Her words were drowned out by the growing roar of the core, its energy spiraling out of control. Kael turned to her, his expression a mix of determination and sorrow. "This is it, Lyra, this is how we win." His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the weight of his decision. The core's light grew brighter, casting eerie shadows across the room. Kael's fingers moved swiftly, inputting the final sequence to overload the system. The machine shuddered violently, sparks flying in every direction. He could feel the heat building, the pressure intensifying. There was no turning back now. Lyra lunged forward, her hand outstretched, but the force of the energy pushed her back. "Kael." Her scream echoed through the facility, a heart-wrenching cry that seemed to hang in the air. He gave her one last look, a silent farewell, before the core erupted in a blinding explosion. The shockwave tore through the facility, shattering walls and reducing the Scavenger's weapon to molten debris. The ground trembled as the structure collapsed, burying Kael beneath the rubble. For a moment, everything was still, a haunting silence that felt like the world itself was holding its breath. Then chaos erupted anew. The Scavengers, caught off guard by the sudden loss of their weapon, scrambled in disarray. Their once formidable advantage was gone, and the tide of the battle shifted almost instantly. Lyra staggered to her feet, her vision blurred by tears and smoke. She stared at the wreckage, her mind refusing to accept what had just happened. Kael was gone. But there was no time to grieve. The fight wasn't over. Lyra clenched her fists, her grief hardening into resolve. Kael had given them this chance, and she wasn't about to let his sacrifice be in vain. She turned to the others, her voice cutting through the din. "We finish this for him." The explosion had not only destroyed the weapon, but also ignited a chain reaction of destruction across the Scavengers' stronghold. Their forces were in disarray, their leadership scrambling to regroup. The Allies, emboldened by the sudden turn of events, pressed their advantage with renewed vigor. What had seemed like an impossible fight moments ago now felt winnable, all because of one man's courage. As the battle raged on, Lyra couldn't shake the image of Kael's face in those final moments. His calm determination, his unwavering resolve. He had known exactly what he was doing, and he had done it without hesitation. That kind of selflessness was rare, even in a world as broken as theirs. It was a reminder of why they fought, not just for survival, but for the hope of something better. The facility continued to crumble around them, its once imposing structure reduced to a smoldering ruin. Lyra moved through the chaos with a singular focus, her grief fueling her determination. Every step, every blow she struck against the Scavengers was a tribute to Kael's sacrifice. He had given them a chance to turn the tide, and she was determined to see it through to the end. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid scent of burning metal as Lyra clawed her way out of the wreckage. Her body ached, every muscle screaming in protest, but she pushed through the pain, her resolve unshaken. The world around her was a chaotic blur, flames licking at the sky, debris scattering in every direction, and the distant cries of the wounded echoing through the ruins. For a moment, she stood there, catching her breath, her eyes scanning the devastation. This was the cost of defiance, the price of standing against the Scavengers. But Lyra knew better than to let despair take hold. She had come too far, fought too hard to let it all end here. With a deep breath, she turned her attention to the others, survivors emerging from the shadows, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion. They looked to her, their leader, for guidance, and Lyra, despite the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders, met their gazes with unwavering determination. She was no longer just a survivor, she had become a symbol of hope, a beacon in the darkness. And now, with the Scavengers' stronghold in sight, she knew the final battle was upon them. This was their chance to end the tyranny that had plagued the wastelands for far too long. Gathering the survivors, Lyra spoke with a voice that carried both strength and compassion. "We've lost much," she began, her words cutting through the tension. "But we've also gained something the Scavengers can never take from us. Unity, purpose, the will to fight for something greater than ourselves. Today we stand together. Today we end this." Her words resonated, igniting a spark in the hearts of those who had endured so much. They nodded, their expressions hardening with resolve. This was their moment, their chance to reclaim what had been stolen from them. The journey to the Scavengers' fortress was fraught with danger. Every step brought them closer to the heart of the enemy's power, but it also meant navigating a labyrinth of traps and patrols. Lyra moved with precision, her instincts honed by years of survival in the wastelands. She led the group through hidden paths and abandoned tunnels, avoiding detection while closing in on their target. Along the way, she shared quiet words of encouragement, reminding them of what was at stake. Each survivor had their own story, their own reasons for fighting, but together they formed a force that was greater than the sum of its parts. As they approached the fortress, the scale of the challenge became clear. The Scavengers' stronghold loomed like a monstrous beast, its walls bristling with weapons and guards. But Lyra had a plan. Drawing on her knowledge of the terrain and the weaknesses she had observed during previous encounters, she orchestrated a coordinated assault. The survivors split into smaller groups, each with a specific task, some to create distractions, others to breach the defenses, and a select few to infiltrate the heart of the fortress. It was a risky strategy, but it was their only chance. The battle that followed was fierce and unrelenting. The Scavengers fought with the desperation of those who knew their time was running out, but the survivors fought with something even more powerful: hope. Lyra was at the forefront, her movements a blur as she struck down enemy after enemy. She fought not just for herself, but for every life that had been lost, for every dream that had been crushed under the Scavenger's boot. Her determination was contagious, rallying the others to push beyond their limits. In the end, it was Lyra who delivered the final blow, facing the Scavenger Leader in a climactic showdown. The fight was brutal, each combatant giving everything they had, but Lyra's resolve was unbreakable. With a final, decisive strike, she brought an end to the reign of terror that had haunted the wastelands for so long. As the fortress crumbled around them, the survivors gathered, their cheers echoing through the ruins. They had done the impossible, they had won, but for Lyra, the victory was bittersweet. She had lost so much along the way: friends, family, a piece of herself. Yet as she looked out over the faces of those she had led to freedom, she knew it had been worth it. The wastelands were far from healed, but for the first time in a long while there was hope. And as long as there was hope, there was a chance for something better. Lyra stood tall, a leader forged in fire, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The battle was over, but the fight for a better future had just begun. The battle against the Scavengers had left Earth scarred but not broken. As the dust settled and the echoes of conflict faded, Lyra stood amidst the survivors, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The energy core, once a weapon of unimaginable destruction, now pulsed with the promise of renewal. Its intricate technology, deciphered through Kael's sacrifice, held the key to healing the planet. "This is what Kael fought for," Lyra whispered, her voice steady yet heavy with emotion. The weight of his memory fueled her determination as she turned to the task ahead, rebuilding a world that had been pushed to the brink of annihilation. The survivors, once scattered and fractured, now rallied around Lyra's vision. Together, they began the monumental work of restoring Earth's ecosystems. The energy core's capabilities were unlike anything they had ever seen. It could purify contaminated water sources, neutralize toxic air particles, and even accelerate the growth of vegetation in barren land. But harnessing its power required more than technical skill. It demanded unity, resilience, and an unshakable belief in the possibility of redemption. Lyra's leadership became the heartbeat of their efforts. She moved among the survivors, offering guidance and encouragement, her presence a constant reminder of what they had lost and what they stood to gain. "Every step we take," she told them, "is a step toward honoring those who gave everything for this chance." Her words resonated deeply, transforming grief into purpose. The survivors, once strangers bound by survival, now worked as a cohesive force driven by a shared dream of a restored Earth. The first priority was the air. Decades of pollution and warfare had left the atmosphere thick with toxins, making it nearly unbreathable in some regions. Using the energy core, they deployed massive filtration systems that absorbed harmful particles and released clean, breathable air. The process was slow, but each day brought visible progress. Skies that had been perpetually gray began to clear, revealing shades of blue that many of the younger survivors had never seen. For the older ones, it was a bittersweet reminder of the world they had once known. Next, they turned their attention to the water. Rivers and lakes, once teeming with life, had become cesspools of industrial waste and radiation. The energy core's purification modules were activated, their hum a constant backdrop as they worked tirelessly to cleanse the waterways. Fish, long absent from these waters, began to return, their silvery forms darting through revitalized streams. It was a small but profound victory, a sign that life could thrive again. But the true test came with the land. Vast stretches of Earth's surface had been reduced to desolate wastelands, devoid of vegetation or wildlife. The energy core's terraforming capabilities allowed them to reintroduce plant life, but it required careful planning and patience. Lyra and her team planted seeds in nutrient-rich soil, their efforts a delicate dance between science and hope. Slowly, green shoots began to emerge, fragile yet resilient, a testament to the planet's enduring spirit. As the ecosystems began to heal, so too did the survivors. Bonds formed in the crucible of survival grew stronger, their shared struggles forging a sense of community that transcended their differences. Children who had known only hardship now laughed and played in fields of wildflowers, their joy a poignant reminder of what they were fighting for. Elders shared stories of the world before the collapse, passing down wisdom and traditions that might otherwise have been lost. Yet Lyra knew their work was far from over. The scars of the past ran deep, and the road to recovery would be long and fraught with challenges. But as she stood amidst the rejuvenated landscapes, she felt a glimmer of something she hadn't dared to hope for: optimism. Kael's sacrifice had not been in vain. The energy core, once a symbol of destruction, had become a beacon of renewal, and Lyra, guided by his memory and driven by her own resolve, would ensure that Earth rose from the ashes stronger and more vibrant than ever before. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the barren landscape as Lyra stood before the freshly carved stone. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the soft rustle of wind through the sparse, brittle grass. She knelt, her hands trembling as she placed a small, weathered pendant, a token Kael had always carried, at the base of the memorial. The stone bore his name, etched deep and permanent, a testament to the life he had given for theirs. "He was the hero we needed," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of grief and gratitude. The words hung in the air, a fragile echo of the man who had stood against the darkness so that others might live. Around her, the survivors gathered, their faces etched with sorrow and respect. Some held flowers scavenged from the sparse fields, others clutched small trinkets, items that had meant something to them, tokens of what Kael had fought to protect. One by one, they stepped forward, placing their offerings at the base of the memorial. A child, no older than 10, laid down a wooden figurine he had carved, his small hands shaking. Lyra's heart ached as she watched him, remembering how Kael had always taken the time to teach the children, to show them kindness in a world that offered little of it. As the ceremony unfolded, Lyra found herself speaking, her voice steadying as she addressed the crowd. Kael wasn't just a fighter, he was a protector. A teacher, a friend. He believed in us when the world seemed hopeless, and because of him we're still here. We owe it to him, to his memory, to keep going. To build something better. Her words resonated through the group, a quiet strength threading through the sorrow. The memorial wasn't just a marker of loss, it was a promise. A promise to remember, to honor, and to carry forward the ideals Kael had embodied. In the days that followed, the memorial became a gathering place. People would come to sit in silence, to reflect, or to share stories of Kael. A young woman spoke of how he had saved her from a raider ambush, his quick thinking and unwavering courage turning the tide. An older man recounted how Kael had shared his last ration with a starving family, refusing to eat until everyone else had been fed. These stories, each one a thread in the tapestry of his life, began to weave a new sense of unity among the survivors. They weren't just remembering Kael, they were finding strength in his legacy. Lyra often found herself returning to the memorial, her thoughts swirling with memories and regrets. She would trace the letters of his name, her fingers brushing against the cold stone as if it could somehow bridge the gap between the living and the dead. One evening, as the first stars began to pierce the twilight, she sat cross-legged before the memorial, her journal open in her lap. She began to write, her pen moving swiftly across the page. "Kael," she began, "you taught us that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about what we do with the life we have. You showed us how to fight, not just for ourselves, but for each other. And now it's our turn to carry that torch." Her words became the foundation of a new tradition, every week someone would step forward to share a story or a lesson inspired by Kael. The memorial became more than a monument to the past, it became a beacon for the future. Children would gather around it, listening wide-eyed as their elders recounted tales of bravery and sacrifice. And in those moments, Lyra could almost feel Kael's presence, his quiet strength lingering in the air, a reminder that even in the darkest times, hope could endure. As the weeks turned into months, the memorial began to change. Flowers began to grow around the base of the stone, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the bleak surroundings. Someone had planted seeds, tending to them with care, and now the blooms stood as a living testament to the resilience Kael had embodied. Lyra smiled as she knelt to touch the petals, her heart swelling with a bittersweet pride. "You'd like this," she murmured, her voice soft but steady. "It's beautiful, just like the world you fought for." The memorial wasn't just a place of remembrance, it was a symbol of what they had lost and what they still had to fight for. It stood as a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the human spirit could endure, could rise, and could rebuild. And as Lyra stood there, the wind tugging at her hair, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Kael's sacrifice had not been in vain. His legacy lived on, not just in the stone that bore his name, but in the hearts of those who carried his memory forward, one step at a time toward a brighter tomorrow. The passage of time brought with it a quiet transformation, one that unfolded slowly but surely across the scarred surface of Earth. Decades had passed since the cataclysm that had driven humanity to the stars, leaving the planet a barren wasteland. But now, the first signs of life were beginning to return. Rivers that had once run black with ash now sparkled under the sun, their waters clear and teeming with fish. Forests, once reduced to skeletal remains, stretched their branches toward the sky, their leaves a vibrant green. The air, once thick with toxic fumes, was now crisp and breathable. Earth was healing, and with it, the hope of humanity. High above, in the orbital colony that had been humanity's refuge, Lyra stood at the observation deck, her gaze fixed on the blue and green sphere below. It had been years since she last set foot on Earth, but the sight of its revival stirred something deep within her. She turned away from the window and made her way to the memorial hall, a quiet space dedicated to those who had given their lives to ensure the survival of their species. At the center of the room stood a simple stone monument etched with the name Kael. Lyra approached the memorial, her footsteps echoing softly in the stillness. She placed a hand on the cold stone, her fingers tracing the grooves of Kael's name. Memories flooded her mind, his unyielding determination, his quiet strength, his unwavering belief in a future worth fighting for. He had been the one to inspire her, to push her to keep going even when the odds seemed insurmountable. And now, as she looked out at the rejuvenated Earth, she knew his sacrifice had not been in vain. "We did it, Kael," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We saved humanity." The words carried the weight of decades of struggle, of loss, of hope rekindled. Lyra had been there from the beginning, from the moment the first warnings of disaster had been ignored, to the desperate scramble to evacuate, to the long years of isolation in the colony. She had watched as humanity teetered on the brink of extinction, and she had fought to pull it back. And now, standing at the memorial, she felt a profound sense of closure. But it wasn't just about survival. Lyra knew that the true victory lay in what came next, the reconnection between the colony and the surface. For years, the orbital station had been a lifeline, a fragile bubble of life in the void. But now it was time to return. Teams of scientists and engineers had already begun the process of establishing outposts on the surface, testing the soil, purifying the water, and preparing the land for permanent settlement. It was a monumental task, but one that Lyra was determined to see through. As she stood there, a soft chime echoed through the hall, signaling the arrival of a transmission from the surface. Lyra turned, her heart quickening as she made her way to the comms station. The screen flickered to life, revealing the face of a young woman, her features framed by the hood of an environmental suit. Behind her, the landscape was a patchwork of green and brown, the first signs of a world reborn. "Lyra," the woman said, her voice filled with excitement. "We've done it. The soil is viable, the water is clean, and the air, it's breathable. We're ready to begin the next phase." Lyra felt a surge of emotion, a mix of pride and relief. She had spent her life fighting for this moment, and now it was finally here. She nodded, her voice steady as she replied, "Prepare the landing teams." "We're coming home." The transmission ended and Lyra turned back to the memorial. She placed her hand on the stone once more, her fingers lingering on Kael's name. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." As she walked away, the weight of the past seemed to lift, replaced by a sense of purpose for the future. Earth was healing, and humanity was ready to reclaim its place among the stars. The journey had been long and arduous, but now, a new chapter was beginning, one filled with hope, possibility, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. The story draws to a close under a sky that no longer feels oppressive. Its once pale gray now streaked with the faintest hues of blue. Lyra stands atop a ridge, her boots planted firmly in the soft, fertile soil that stretches out before her, a stark contrast to the barren wasteland she once roamed. The air is crisp, carrying the faint scent of blooming wildflowers and the distant hum of life returning to the planet. Her gaze sweeps across the horizon, where patches of green have begun to reclaim the land, their vibrancy a testament to the resilience of Earth. Yet, amidst this renewal, her heart carries the weight of a sacrifice that will forever mark this moment. Kael's absence is a quiet ache, a void that no amount of progress can fill. His name lingers in her thoughts, a steady echo of the choices that brought them here. She remembers the way he had looked at her in those final moments, calm, resolute, and unyielding in his belief that this was the only way. His sacrifice had not been in vain. The terraforming device, once a relic of humanity's hubris, had been repurposed into a beacon of hope, its energy coursing through the planet's core, awakening dormant life. The wastelands were no longer wastelands. Earth was healing, and with it, the possibility of a future worth fighting for. Lyra's fingers brush against the pendant around her neck, a simple piece of metal Kael had given her long ago. It had been a symbol of their bond, a promise that no matter how far they strayed, they would always find their way back to each other. Now it feels heavier, a reminder of what she has lost and what she has gained. She closes her eyes, letting the warmth of the sun wash over her, and for the first time in what feels like an eternity, she allows herself to breathe. Not the shallow, cautious breaths of survival, but deep, full breaths that fill her lungs with the promise of tomorrow. Around her, the world stirs. Birds, their feathers still dusted with the remnants of ash, take flight, their songs tentative but unmistakable. Streams that had once run dry now glisten under the sunlight, their waters clear and alive with the flicker of fish. Even the wind seems to carry a different tune, no longer howling with the despair of a dying planet but whispering secrets of renewal. Lyra knows this is not the end. It is a beginning, fragile and uncertain, but a beginning nonetheless. Her lips part and the words come softly, carried on the breeze like a whisper to the past. "We were lost in the wastelands," she says, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "But now we're home." The phrase lingers, a bittersweet acknowledgement of all they have endured and all they have achieved. Home is no longer a place, it is a feeling, a memory, a promise. It is the laughter of children yet to be born, the rustle of leaves in a forest yet to grow, and the quiet strength of those who dared to hope when hope seemed impossible. As she turns away from the horizon, Lyra feels a surge of determination. The road ahead will not be easy. There will be challenges, setbacks, and moments when the weight of the past threatens to pull her under. But she will carry on for Kael, for herself, and for the future that now glimmers on the edge of possibility. The wastelands may have shaped her, but they do not define her. She is more than a survivor. She is a builder, a storyteller, a keeper of hope. And as she walks away from the ridge, her footsteps firm and purposeful, the world seems to breathe with her. The sky stretches wide, the earth pulses with life, and somewhere in the quiet corners of her heart, Lyra knows that Kael's sacrifice has not just saved a planet, it has saved her. Together they were lost, now she is found, and in this new world she will find her way.